Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can. Maybe you're listening from a bedroom with the lights low, maybe from a couch after a long day, maybe from a quiet kitchen where the house has finally settled down. Wherever you are, I want you to take a moment and notice something very ordinary around you. A chair, a lamp, a window, the sound of traffic outside, the small things that make a night feel normal. Because tonight we are going to step into a day when ordinary things did not feel ordinary at all. A day when getting on a bus was not just getting on a bus. When packing a sandwich was not just packing lunch. When standing in a crowd was not just standing in a crowd. A day when people woke up before sunrise, put on their best clothes, walked out of their homes, and became part of one of the most important public gatherings in American history. Tonight we're going to Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963. Not to the Washington of postcards exactly, not only to marble buildings and monuments and clean photographs in history textbooks, but to the real Washington of that morning, the Washington of buses arriving in the dark, the Washington of train stations filling with people who had barely slept, the Washington of police officers watching carefully, the Washington of volunteers handing out signs, the Washington of families who had travelled through the night because they believed that the country had reached a point where silence was no longer something they could live with, and at the centre of it all was a simple act that became enormous because so many people did it at once. They showed up. Around 250,000 people came to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That number is so large that it can become almost useless if we say it too quickly. 250,000 people. Enough people to fill city blocks. Enough people to turn wide avenues into rivers of hats, dresses, shirt sleeves, church shoes, work shoes, hand-painted signs, lunch bags, tired faces, serious faces, and faces that were trying very hard to look calm. It was one of the largest demonstrations for civil rights in American history up to that time. But before it became a famous photograph, before it became a line in a school textbook, before it became the day most people remember because of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. standing at the Lincoln Memorial and saying the words, "I have a dream," it was a morning. A real morning. With people waking up stiff from bus seats, checking on children, smoothing wrinkled jackets, asking where to go, looking for restrooms, waiting for friends, and trying to understand what it meant to be part of something that was already larger than any one of them. That is the part of history I want us to stay close to tonight. Not just the speech, though we will get there. Not just the leaders, though they matter deeply. Not just the famous image of the crowd stretching along the reflecting pool. I want us to begin with the human weight of the day. The small decisions that made the large event possible. The people who looked at the news from Birmingham, looked at their own towns, looked at the jobs they were denied, the schools their children were sent to, the neighbourhoods they were kept out of, the voting booths they were blocked from, and decided that Washington needed to see them, not as an idea, not as a political problem, as people. Now, I want to ask you something before we go further. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere quiet, somewhere noisy, somewhere warm, somewhere where the day has not quite let go of you yet? And when you think about a crowd that large, what do you imagine first? Do you imagine the sound, the heat, the fear, the hope? Do you imagine one person standing in the middle of it, trying to see the stage and realizing they are surrounded by strangers who came for the same reason? I ask because history often becomes too clean once it is remembered. It gets pressed flat. It becomes a date, a name, a quotation, a black and white photograph. But the people who lived it did not experience it as a finished lesson. They experienced it minute by minute, with uncertainty, discomfort, planning, worry, and the constant question of whether the country would listen. And that question was not a small one. In the summer of 1963, the United States was tense in a way that is difficult to fully picture if all we remember is the calm dignity of the photographs. The civil rights movement had been building for years through boycotts, lawsuits, sit-ins, freedom rides, voter registration campaigns, jailings, beatings, church meetings, student organising and local acts of courage that rarely made national headlines. By the time August arrived, Americans had seen images from Birmingham that were almost impossible to forget. Children and teenagers had been sprayed with fire hoses, police dogs had been turned on demonstrators. The city had become a national symbol of just how far officials were willing to go to defend segregation. Earlier that summer, President John F. Kennedy had gone on television and called civil rights a moral issue, but speeches from presidents did not automatically change daily life. A bill had been proposed, a debate was coming. The law had not yet changed, and for millions of black Americans the question was not whether the country could speak beautifully about freedom. The question was whether it could finally do something about it. That is why the full name matters. The event was not simply called the March on Washington. It was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Those last three words are essential: jobs and freedom. The march was not only about ending segregation at lunch counters or opening the doors of public schools, though those things mattered. It was also about work, wages, unemployment, dignity, the right to earn a living without being locked out by discrimination, the right to apply for a job and be judged by ability instead of skin colour, the right to live in a country where freedom was not limited to what the law said on paper, but reached into paychecks, housing, schools, unions, offices, factories and voting booths. This was not a symbolic walk for a vague feeling of national goodness. It was a public demand. And here is something worth noticing carefully. A march of 250,000 people does not happen because people suddenly wake up one morning and decide to gather. It has to be built, quietly, patiently. With phone calls, church announcements, union networks, mimeographed flyers, train schedules, permits, arguments, meetings that run too long, leaders who disagree, volunteers who are exhausted before the day even begins, and organisers who understand that one mistake could give their enemies exactly what they want. The March on Washington had deep roots. The idea of marching on the Capitol had been connected for decades to A. Philip Randolph, the Labour leader who had threatened a march in 1941 to protest discrimination in defence industries and pressure President Franklin Roosevelt into action. More than 20 years later, Randolph was still there, still insisting that economic justice and civil rights belong together. Alongside him was Bayard Rustin, one of the most skilled organisers in American history, a man whose work shaped the march down to the smallest practical details. Rustin understood something that sounds simple until you try to do it. If thousands of people are going to come to Washington, they have to arrive, move, eat, hear, stay safe, and leave. Inspiration alone does not arrange buses. Moral urgency does not build a sound system. Hope does not print maps. So before the crowd ever reached the National Mall, there were lists, routes, marshals, medical stations, portable toilets, lost child plans, press areas, timetables, instructions for what to do if someone tried to provoke violence. The organisers knew the whole country would be watching. They knew opponents of the civil rights movement were waiting for disorder, waiting for one broken window, one fight, one image they could use to dismiss the entire demand for justice. The march had to be massive, but it also had to be disciplined. It had to be emotional, but controlled. It had to feel like the voice of a people who had waited far too long without giving those in power an excuse to turn away. That balance took planning on a scale that is easy to miss when we only remember the beautiful parts. There is a kind of courage in that kind of planning that does not always get enough attention. We like to imagine courage as the dramatic moment, the speech, the arrest, the confrontation, the person standing alone against a hostile crowd. And yes, that kind of courage was everywhere in the civil rights movement. But there was also the courage of paperwork, the courage of phone trees, the courage of raising money for buses, the courage of asking people to trust that if they travelled hundreds of miles, the movement would be ready for them when they arrived. The courage of telling a mother that her teenage son would be safe enough to go. The courage of telling workers that this day away from their job mattered, even if losing a day's wages hurt. The courage of making the practical world serve a moral purpose. By the evening before the march, people were already moving. Some came from New York and Philadelphia, which were close enough by comparison, though still not simple. Some came from Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, Atlanta, Birmingham, and far smaller towns that rarely appear in national histories. They came by bus in long overnight rides where sleep came in short pieces. They came by train, carrying bags and signs. They came in cars packed with relatives and neighbours. Churches organised groups. Labour unions sent members. Student groups came with the particular energy of young people who had already been sitting in, standing up, going to jail, and learning that history did not move unless somebody pushed it. Some people came because they had marched before. Others came because they could not forgive themselves if they stayed home. Picture one bus for a moment. Not all of them. Just one. It is dark outside. The passengers have been riding for hours. Someone near the front is trying to sleep with their hat pulled low. A woman has wrapped food in paper for the trip because buying meals on the road is not guaranteed, especially if the route passes through places where black travellers know they may not be welcome. Someone has a sign resting carefully between their knees so it will not bend. A few people are whispering because the bus is too quiet for normal conversation. A young person looks out the window and sees nothing but the occasional gas station, the dull shine of road signs, the blur of towns they will not stop in. They are tired, but the tiredness does not feel like ordinary tiredness. It has anticipation inside it. It has worry inside it. It has the strange alertness people feel when they know that tomorrow may matter. What did they expect to happen when they arrived? That depended on who you asked. Some expected a peaceful demonstration and speeches. Some worried there would be violence. Some believed the march would pressure Congress to pass civil rights legislation. Some wanted the president to move faster. Some came because the movement had asked and because answering that call felt like a duty. Some came for jobs. Some came for voting rights. Some came for their children. Some came because they had watched too many people humiliated in public and told to wait. Waiting had become one of the great injuries of the period. Wait for the courts. Wait for the legislature. Wait for local officials. Wait for gradual change. Wait for the right time. But for a person born into segregation, wait could mean childhood, adulthood, old age, and death. The March on Washington was, among other things, a refusal to keep waiting quietly. It is important to remember that not everyone in power welcomed the march. There were real fears in the Kennedy administration about security, disorder, and political consequences. Washington prepared carefully. Thousands of police, National Guardsmen and troops were placed on alert. Liquor sales were restricted. Hospitals prepared for emergencies. Federal workers were told they could leave early. The city braced itself in some ways as if an army were coming, and that alone tells you something about how protest was understood. 250,000 citizens planning to stand before the Lincoln Memorial and ask their government to honour its own promises was treated by some officials as a possible threat to public order. The organisers knew this. The marchers knew this too. They came anyway. And the choice of place was not accidental. The Lincoln Memorial carried enormous meaning. Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years earlier, in 1863. Now, in 1963, black Americans were still demanding full citizenship in a country that had ended slavery, but had not ended the systems built to replace and preserve racial inequality. To stand before Lincoln's seated figure was to make a direct argument with American memory. The marchers were not asking the country to invent a new principle from nothing. They were asking it to live up to the principles it already claimed: freedom, equality, citizenship, the right to work, the right to vote, the right to enter a school, a restaurant, a bus station, a neighbourhood, a workplace, and not be treated as less than fully human. There is something deeply practical about that kind of idealism. It sounds large when spoken from a podium, but for the people in the crowd it was tied to daily life. It meant whether your child had a decent school, whether you could stay at a hotel while travelling, whether your father could get hired for a job he was qualified to do, whether your mother could vote without being threatened or tricked or turned away, whether a young person could sit at a lunch counter without being dragged out, whether a family could move through the country without planning every mile around humiliation and danger. These were not distant philosophical questions. They were the shape of a normal day. That is what I want us to keep in mind as we begin. The March on Washington was not only a day of speeches. It was the result of many ordinary days that had become unbearable. It was made out of bus tickets, church basements, union halls, kitchen conversations, handwritten letters, careful organising, and the memory of insults that people carried in their bodies because there was nowhere else to put them. It was made out of parents who were tired of explaining unfairness to children. It was made out of workers who were tired of being told they should be grateful for less. It was made out of students who had learned that sitting still in the right place could be considered a crime. It was made out of elders who had seen promises broken for decades and still chose to believe pressure could matter. And before we move deeper into that day, before we follow the buses into the Capitol and stand in the crowd and listen to the voices from the platform, I want to say this gently. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself settling into these slower histories, the ones about ordinary people caught inside extraordinary moments, it would mean the world to me if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something in the story makes you pause. Do it when a detail stays with you. And if you want to share where you're listening from tonight, leave it in the comments. I read those, and I like knowing the small places where these old stories are finding someone in the present. Now let's return to that morning. The Capitol is beginning to wake. The air is warm because it is late August in Washington, and anyone who has spent time there knows that summer does not leave politely. It lingers on the pavement. It sits in the clothing. It makes patience harder. Volunteers are already in place. Marshals are preparing to guide the movement of the crowd. Signs are being distributed, many of them printed in the same clear lettering so the message will not be mistaken. People are arriving faster now. Some are dressed for church. Some are dressed for travel. Some have brought children because they want them to remember. Some have left children at home because they are afraid of what might happen. The Washington Monument rises in the distance. The reflecting pool waits in the middle of the mall, still and formal, as if it does not yet understand that the space around it is about to fill with people. And somewhere in that growing crowd there is a person who has never been to Washington before. Maybe a woman from Georgia. Maybe a young man from Baltimore. Maybe a union worker from Detroit. Maybe a college student from North Carolina, who's already learned how heavy fear can feel when you're sitting at a lunch counter and pretending your hands are not shaking. This person steps down from a bus or out of a train station, or from the back seat of a crowded car and looks around. The city is real now. The march is no longer a plan discussed in meetings or printed on a flyer. It is here. And for the first time, perhaps, they begin to understand that they are not alone. Not in the private sense, not in the quiet moral sense people say to comfort each other. Literally not alone. Everywhere they look, more people are coming. That realization matters. It is one thing to believe that injustice is wrong. It is another thing to stand with tens of thousands of people who believe it with you. There is power in seeing the size of your own cause. There is power in hearing footsteps that are not just yours. There is power in looking across a crowd and understanding that the thing you've been told to endure quietly is not private failure, not personal bad luck, not the way life simply has to be, but part of a national system that can be named, challenged, and changed. For many who came that day, the march was not only a message to Washington, it was a message to themselves. The morning keeps building. Buses continue to arrive. The sidewalks fill. The ordinary machinery of the city has to make room for something it cannot quite control. People ask directions. People laugh a little too loudly because they are nervous. People greet friends from other cities. People look for the group they came with. Songs begin in one place and then fade, then begin somewhere else. The mood is disciplined, but not cold. Serious, but not grim. There is a strange combination of picnic, church meeting, labour rally, memorial service, and political demand in the air. No single description quite fits because the day is carrying too much, and that is where the story truly begins to widen. Because those 250,000 people did not come from nowhere. They brought with them years of pressure, generations of disappointment, and a very specific list of demands. To understand why they stood there, we have to go back before the buses, before the platform, before the cameras, into the workplaces, schools, churches, streets and courtrooms that made staying home feel impossible. To understand why so many people decided they could not stay home, you have to begin with a simple fact that is easy to say and hard to feel. By 1963, millions of black Americans had been asked to wait for nearly a century after slavery ended. They had been told to wait after the Civil War, wait after Reconstruction, wait after the Supreme Court allowed segregation to harden into law, wait after soldiers came home from 2 world wars, wait after court decisions promised change, wait after presidents gave careful speeches, wait after local officials said the time was not right, wait after each small victory was followed by a new delay, a new excuse, a new rule, a new form of humiliation dressed up as order. For people living inside that history, waiting was not a neutral thing. Waiting had weight. Waiting meant children growing up in schools that were separate and unequal. Waiting meant older people dying before they ever cast a ballot. Waiting meant men and women working for less money, being pushed into the dirtiest jobs, or being refused work entirely because someone at a desk decided their skin made them less employable. Waiting meant planning a trip around the knowledge that you might not be able to eat, sleep, use a restroom, or buy gas without insult or danger. Waiting meant being told that the country believed in freedom while your own life kept proving otherwise. This is the part that can disappear when the March on Washington is remembered only as a beautiful day. It was beautiful in many ways. It was disciplined. It was large. It produced one of the most famous speeches in American history. But the reason people came was not because beauty was missing from their lives. They came because pressure had been building for generations. They came because the ordinary machinery of American life had been arranged against them, and by the summer of 1963 the sound of that machinery was impossible to ignore. Think about a black parent in the South in the early 1960s sending a child to school. The Supreme Court had declared school segregation unconstitutional in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, but a court decision did not automatically place a child at a decent desk with decent books and a safe way to learn. In many places, officials delayed. They resisted. They invented plans that moved slowly enough to preserve the old system under new language. Some districts closed schools rather than integrate them. Some white communities harassed the first black children who entered previously white schools. A parent could believe in the law and still fear the walk to the schoolhouse. That was the daily contradiction. The Constitution said one thing, the street said another. Now move from the schoolhouse to the voting booth. Voting is often described as a civic right, but for many black Americans in the South, it was treated like a privilege that local officials could deny almost at will. Literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, impossible registration rules, economic threats, violence, and the quiet knowledge that your name might be remembered by the wrong people all stood between citizens and the ballot. A person could be old enough to have raised children, worked for decades, paid taxes, buried parents, served in war, and still be treated like a stranger at the courthouse when election season came. The denial was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was a form, a question, a clerk behind a desk saying no, a sheriff leaning in the doorway, a boss who heard you had tried to register and suddenly no longer had work for you. The system did not need to shout every time. It knew how to speak softly and still be understood. Then there was work. That word sat in the title of the march for a reason: jobs and freedom. The order matters, not because jobs were more important than freedom, but because the organisers understood that freedom without economic security could become a thin thing. A person might win the legal right to enter a public building and still not earn enough to feed a family. A person might be able to sit at a lunch counter and still not be hired by the store that served the food. A person might hear the country praise liberty while being trapped in a labour market that kept black workers last hired, first fired, underpaid, excluded from unions, or pushed into work with no protections. Philip Randolph had understood this for decades. He was not new to the problem. He had spent much of his life organising black workers and challenging both racism and economic exploitation. To him, the demand for civil rights and the demand for decent work were not separate. They were the same argument spoken in two different rooms. That is one reason the march drew people from labour unions, churches, civil rights organisations, student groups, and ordinary households that might not have used the same political language but understood the same facts. The rent had to be paid, food had to be bought, children needed shoes, a family needed a paycheck that did more than keep hunger 1 week away. When organisers called for a federal jobs programme, a higher minimum wage, fair employment protections and access to decent work, they were not adding economic issues as an afterthought. They were describing the daily life of people who knew that discrimination did not stop at the doorway of a school or bus station. It entered the payroll office, it entered the hiring line, it entered the bank, it entered the landlord's decision. It entered the kitchen table where a mother counted money and knew there was not enough. Let us stay at that kitchen table for a moment, because large movements are often built there before they are built in the streets. Imagine an evening in 1963. A family is deciding whether to go to Washington. The radio is on somewhere in the room, or maybe a newspaper lies folded on the table. Someone from church has announced that seats are available on a bus. A union local has encouraged members to join. A student has come home from a meeting full of urgency and conviction. The trip costs money. Not a fortune, perhaps, but enough to matter. The person who goes may miss work. They may have to ask someone to watch children. They may have to travel through places where a black traveller is never completely at ease. They may have to explain to an employer why they will not be present. They may have to face neighbours who think protest brings trouble. None of this is simple. It is one thing to believe in justice while sitting at home. It is another thing to pay for a bus seat, pack a bag, and place your body where the country can count it. And yet, people did. That is what should hold our attention. They didn't come because travel was easy. They came because staying home had begun to feel like another form of consent. They came because images from Birmingham had entered American living rooms and made denial harder. In the spring of 1963, the Birmingham campaign had shown the country what local segregationist power looked like when challenged by disciplined protest. Demonstrators were arrested. Children and teenagers joined the campaign. Police used dogs and fire hoses against them. Photographs and television footage carried those scenes far beyond Alabama. A viewer in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles could sit safely in a chair and see a child knocked by water pressure or a police dog lunging at a young person. The images were difficult to dismiss because they were so plain. They showed power defending segregation with force, and they showed children absorbing that force with a discipline that made many Americans uncomfortable in a way speeches alone had not. This is worth saying carefully. The movement did not rely on suffering because suffering was noble. People were already suffering. What the movement did was force the country to look at it. That distinction matters. Birmingham did not create the cruelty of segregation. It exposed it under lights bright enough that the rest of the nation could not pretend it was local custom, or gradual tradition, or something outsiders should not judge. When the hoses came out, when the dogs came out, when children were jailed, the usual language of patience began to sound obscene. Many people who had been told to wait saw those images and understood that Washington could not remain a distant place of marble and procedure. It had to be confronted. The year kept adding reasons. On June 11th, 1963, President Kennedy addressed the nation on civil rights and called it a moral issue. That same day in Alabama, Governor George Wallace had made his stand at the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama, trying to block the enrollment of two black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood. Federal authority had to be used to enforce what should have been ordinary access to education. The scene was symbolic, almost too symbolic. A state governor standing in a doorway, black students trying to enter, the federal government pressing against local resistance. A whole national argument reduced to a door and the people on either side of it. Then, in the early hours of June 12th, Medgar Evers was murdered outside his home in Jackson, Mississippi. He was a civil rights leader, a husband, a father, a man who had spent years working against segregation and racial violence. He had come home late. His children were inside. He was shot in his own driveway. There are historical events that become public facts, and then there are historical events that enter people's homes, like grief. Evers's murder did that. It reminded people that the demand for rights was not an argument taking place safely in newspapers. It was dangerous. It could follow a person back to the front door. It could leave a family standing over blood in the place where their father should have been safe. By late summer, the march was no longer simply a tactic. It had become a gathering point for anger, mourning, discipline, and demand. The people who came to Washington were not all the same. That's another thing worth resisting in our memory. A crowd looks unified from a distance because distance smooths out difference. But inside that crowd were many motives, many experiences, many levels of risk. There were ministers who had spent years persuading congregations to join the struggle. There were domestic workers who knew what it was to labour in someone else's house and still be treated as inferior. There were students from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who had already become veterans of danger while still young enough to be called boys and girls by their elders. There were union workers who believed wages and rights had to rise together. There were white allies, some deeply committed, some newly awakened, some still learning what the movement required of them. There were famous leaders and people whose names were never recorded. There were those who came with confidence and those who came afraid. Fear deserves a place in this story because courage without fear is too easy. Many people who travelled to Washington had reasons to worry. Public demonstrations could turn violent. Police could be hostile. White supremacists could attack. Employers could retaliate. Names could be noticed. Photographs could circulate. In some communities, being seen at a civil rights event was not just a political statement. It was a risk attached to your job, your housing, your safety, and your family. A person did not need to be paranoid to think carefully before going. They only needed to know the world they lived in. And still, the buses filled. There is something about that simple fact that carries more power the longer you sit with it. A seat on a bus is ordinary. It has a narrow back, a window that may or may not open, a small metal ashtray in the armrest in those days, a floor that collects dust from everyone's shoes. But in August of 1963, thousands of ordinary bus seats became part of a national act. People boarded in church parking lots and city streets, outside union halls and meeting places, carrying paper bags with sandwiches, maybe a thermos, maybe a change of clothes, maybe nothing but the clothes they had chosen carefully for the day. They were not going to a festival. They were not going to be entertained. They were going to be counted. Being counted was not symbolic in some empty way. In a democracy, numbers are supposed to matter. But black Americans had learned that moral rightness alone did not guarantee political action. A single person could be ignored. A small group could be dismissed. A local protest could be called local trouble. But 250,000 people in the capital could not be waved away so easily. The crowd itself would become evidence. It would show Congress, the White House, the press, and the country that the demand for civil rights was not the obsession of a few agitators, as opponents often claimed. It was broad, organised, disciplined and national. Opponents understood that too, which is why they tried to discredit the march before it happened. Some warned that it would lead to disorder. Some suggested it was influenced by radicals. Some treated the very idea of mass protest in the capital as irresponsible. These warnings were not neutral concerns about safety. They were part of a long habit of making black political action seem dangerous simply because it was black political action. If people protested too forcefully, they were called threatening. If they protested peacefully, they were told to be patient. If they went to court, the courts were slow. If they went to the streets were called inappropriate. Every path to change seemed to come with a lecture about timing and manners. This is why the discipline of the march mattered so much. The organisers knew they were walking into a trap that had been set many times before. Any disorder could be used against them. Any conflict could become the image that opponents needed. Bayard Rustin and the planning team treated order not as decoration but as strategy. Marshals were trained, signs were standardised, instructions were clear. The marchers were asked to place the cause above personal impulse. This was not because anger was absent. Anger was everywhere, and it had good reasons. But anger had to be carried in a form the nation could not easily dismiss. That is a difficult thing to ask of people who have been denied dignity for too long. It asks them to suffer injustice and then manage the emotions of those watching. Yet many did it because they understood the stakes. There is another reason people could not stay home, one that is quieter but just as important. The movement had created a sense of shared obligation. Churches had preached about it. Organisers had spoken about it. Student groups had acted on it. Local communities had raised money for it. When a movement reaches that point, participation becomes more than a personal decision. It becomes a way of answering a question from history itself. Where were you when it mattered? Did you go? Did you help? Did you send someone? Did you pray? Did you organise? Did you make sandwiches? Did you watch the children so someone else could travel? Not everyone could go to Washington, and the organisers knew that. But those who did go carried more than themselves. They carried families, congregations, co-workers, neighbours, and local struggles that could not all fit onto the buses. That is why it is wrong to imagine the 250,000 as only the people present. Behind them were many more. The person who stayed home to cover someone's shift. The grandmother who watched the children. The church member who donated a few dollars toward a bus. The cook who packed food. The local organiser who made calls. The people too old, too poor, too frightened, too ill, or too tied to responsibilities to travel, but who still felt represented when the crowd appeared on television. A movement is never only the bodies visible in the photograph. It is also the invisible work that made those bodies able to stand there. And for many black Americans, the march answered a need that politics alone could not satisfy. It offered the experience of public dignity. That may sound simple until you imagine living in a society that repeatedly denies it. Segregation was not only a legal system, it was a daily performance of insult. Separate doors, separate counters, separate waiting rooms, separate schools, separate restrooms, titles withheld, names ignored, adults called by first names by white strangers, skilled workers treated as incapable, respect made conditional. The cruelty of that system was not only that it limited opportunity, though it did. It also forced people to absorb small degradations so often that endurance itself became exhausting. To stand in Washington among hundreds of thousands of people demanding rights was to step out of that imposed smallness. It was to be visible on purpose. It was to stand upright in public space and refuse the role assigned by segregation. That mattered. It mattered even before a single speech began. It mattered when a person looked around and saw nurses, porters, teachers, students, ministers, factory workers, parents, veterans, Secretaries, maids, barbers, cooks, musicians, and children all gathered in the same cause. The crowd was not only asking for dignity, it was practicing it. There is a detail about the March on Washington that modern memory sometimes misses. The mood was not wild, it was not reckless. Reporters noticed the order of the event, the calm of the crowd, the way people moved with seriousness and purpose. This does not mean the day lacked emotion. It means the emotion was held. That restraint came from training, from church culture, from nonviolent discipline, from respectability politics in some cases, from strategy, from fear, from hope, and from the practical knowledge that the whole country was watching. A person in that crowd might have wanted to shout everything they had been forced to swallow. Instead, many stood quietly, sang when songs began, listened when speeches started, and let the sighs of the gathering speak with a force that did not need chaos to be heard. The word freedom can become too large if we do not keep tying it back to concrete things. For the people who came, freedom meant entering a public library without being refused. It meant sending a child to a school with the same resources as anyone else's child. It meant registering to vote without fear. It meant a job that paid fairly. It meant protection from police brutality. It meant the right to travel without a guidebook telling you which towns might serve you and which might humiliate you. It meant the right to live where your income allowed you to live. It meant not having to explain to your child why the country's flag belonged to them in theory, but not always in practice. It meant the removal of thousands of daily barriers that white Americans could move through without noticing, because the barriers had not been built for them. That is why the march could gather such a wide coalition. Different people emphasized different demands, but the central claim was clear. The United States had promised citizenship and withheld too much of it from too many of its own people. The marchers came to collect on that promise. They came to say that the debt was old. They came to say that partial change was not enough. They came to say that a civil rights bill without enforcement would not be enough, that desegregation without jobs would not be enough, that voting rights without protection would not be enough, that national speeches without local change would not be enough. The demand was not for kindness. It was for law, enforcement, work, wages, education, safety, and respect. There were people who wondered whether one day could really matter. That is a fair question. A march does not desegregate a school by itself. A crowd does not pass a bill by itself. A speech does not end discrimination by itself. The organisers knew this. The marchers knew it too. They were not naive. Many of them had already seen how hard power fights to keep its shape. But a day can gather force. A day can make private suffering public. A day can place pressure where politicians feel it. A day can create an image that travels farther than any single organiser could travel. A day can remind discouraged people that they are many. A day can make delay more expensive for those who prefer delay. August 28th, 1963 mattered because it did not stand alone. It concentrated years of work into one visible act. So when we say 250,000 Americans changed history in one day, we have to be careful. They did not change it by magic. They changed it because that one day rested on thousands of earlier days. Days of walking instead of riding buses in Montgomery. Days of sitting at lunch counters while mobs screamed. Days of riding through the South on freedom rides knowing the next stop might bring violence. Days in jail. Days in court. Days in church basements. Days at typewriters. Days knocking on doors for voter registration. Days burying people who should not have died. Days explaining to children why courage was necessary. The march was one day, but it carried all of that with it. And now, as the morning of August 28th comes closer in our story, those reasons begin to take physical shape. They become luggage. They become tickets. They become printed signs. They become polished shoes set by a door before dawn. They become a mother waking a child early and saying it is time to go. They become a minister counting heads in a parking lot. They become a student folding a jacket into a bag. They become a worker climbing onto a bus after a full shift because missing the ride would feel worse than losing the sleep. They become engines starting in the dark, trains pulling out of stations, cars moving north, south, east and west toward the same city. The decision had been made. Staying home was no longer possible for those who could go. The reasons had filled the room, filled the church, filled the Union Hall, filled the bus station, until movement felt like the only honest answer. And once that movement began, the story changed from why they came to how they got there, because every mile to Washington carried its own risks, its own discomforts, and its own small acts of preparation. The reasons had filled the room, filled the church, filled the Union Hall, filled the bus station, until movement felt like the only honest answer. And once that movement began, the story became much more practical than most people imagine. It became a story of roads, schedules, tired feet, train platforms, church parking lots, borrowed cars, chartered buses, paper bags of food, and people trying to get to Washington without losing the seriousness of why they were going. A movement can sound grand when described from far away, but on the night before the march on Washington, it had to become transportation. It had to become a seat number. It had to become a departure time. It had to become someone saying, "Do not be late because the bus cannot wait." That is one of the details that brings the whole day back down to earth. Before 250,000 people could stand before the Lincoln Memorial, they had to get there. Before the crowd became a historic image, it was thousands of separate departures happening in darkness and early morning. People locked doors behind them. They checked pockets. They folded jackets over arms. They held children by the hand. They climbed steps into buses. They walk through train stations with the slightly stiff posture of people who know they are part of something serious and do not want to look confused. Some had never been to Washington before. Some had never been that far from home. Some had travelled for civil rights work many times and knew the road too well. All of them were entering the same day from different directions. The organisers understood that the journey itself had to be orderly. This was not a casual matter. If people arrived late, the programme could be disrupted. If groups became separated, confusion could spread. If transportation failed, the size of the demonstration would shrink before it began. The march had already made officials nervous. Opponents were waiting for signs of disorder. Reporters would be looking not only at the speeches but at the crowd, the movement, the discipline, the smallest details that could be shaped into a story. So the work of getting people to Washington became part of the politics of the day. Every bus that arrived safely was a quiet success. Every group that found its place was proof of planning. Every person who stepped from a train into the capital and moved toward the mall without confusion helped make the day possible. Bayard Rustin and the planning staff did not treat transportation as something that would take care of itself. Rustin knew mass action from the inside. He had organised demonstrations before. He understood non-violence not only as a moral principle but as a logistical practice. People needed instructions, they needed meeting points, they needed marshals. They needed to know what to bring and what not to bring. They needed to know how to behave if they were insulted, delayed, provoked or frightened. It was not enough to tell thousands of people to come. The movement had to make the coming possible. Imagine the planning table in the weeks before the march, maps of Washington, lists of state coordinators, calls from local groups asking where their buses should park. Questions about train schedules, meal arrangements, lost children, medical care, restrooms, and how to move a crowd from the Washington Monument toward the Lincoln Memorial without turning the event into a bottleneck. The details were not glamorous. They were also not secondary. A march that cannot move is not a march. A crowd that cannot hear becomes restless. A demonstration without food, shade, water, and direction can become dangerous even when everyone arrives with peaceful intentions. This is the kind of work that disappears from memory because it succeeded. When logistics fail, everyone notices. When they work, history remembers the speeches. For those travelling from nearby cities, The journey could still be long. Washington was close to Baltimore and Philadelphia by distance, but distance is not the only measure that matters. A person had to wake early, gather with others, wait in lines, board transport, follow instructions, and then spend the day standing, walking, listening, and returning home exhausted. From New York, the movement of people was enormous. Buses left from neighborhoods and terminals, train stations filled. People came from Harlem, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, church groups, unions, local civil rights branches, student circles, and families who had decided that a child old enough to remember should see the day with their own eyes. The city had its own rhythm, its own late-night noise, but on that night the normal movement of New York bent toward Washington. Now look farther out. Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Birmingham, Little Rock. Towns whose names did not appear on national maps of power, but whose people understood the issue as sharply as anyone in Washington. Some rides took many hours, some took most of a day. Some people came from the west by plane because the distance was too great for a quick bus ride. Some travelled in cars with relatives or neighbours, splitting costs, taking turns staying awake, carrying food because eating on the road could not be assumed. A white traveller might think of a roadside diner as a convenience. A black traveller in 1963 could not think that way so easily. Travel carried questions. Would they be served? Would a restroom be available? Would the stop be safe? Would a driver refuse? Would a sheriff appear? Would a simple pause on the road become a reminder of everything they were marching against? This is something modern listeners need to sit with carefully. The trip to Washington was not separate from segregation. The road itself was part of the problem. For many black Americans, travel had long required planning around humiliation. Families carried food not only to save money, but because food service could be denied. They carried water because facilities might not be safe or open to them. They planned routes with caution. They knew which places had reputations. The Green Book had existed for years because black travellers needed guidance on where they could sleep, eat, buy gas, and survive ordinary travel with some measure of dignity. By 1963, some laws had changed, and interstate travel had become a major battleground. But custom, hostility, and local practice did not disappear, simply because a federal ruling said they should. So when people travelled to a march for freedom, the journey itself reminded them why the march was necessary. Picture a church parking lot before dawn. The air is still dark, not quite morning, not quite night. A few cars arrive with headlights cutting across the pavement. People step out quietly at first, then begin greeting one another in low voices. Someone is checking names on a clipboard. Someone has brought coffee in a large container. Someone has wrapped sandwiches in wax paper. A woman adjusts a child's collar because she wants him to look proper in Washington. A man carries a sign under one arm and a folded newspaper under the other. The bus waits with its engine running, warm diesel smell hanging in the air. The driver stands near the door, impatient but polite enough. The minister says a prayer before boarding, not long enough to delay the schedule, but long enough to remind everyone that this is not a sightseeing trip. People climb aboard, the door folds shut. The bus pulls away and the church lot empties behind them. Inside that bus, the day has already begun, even though Washington is still hours away. At first, people talk. They ask where others are from, who is meeting whom, whether anyone has heard the latest from the organisers. Then the road settles them. The sound of the engine takes over. Someone sleeps with their cheek against the window. Someone tries to read but gives up because the motion of the bus makes the words move. A few people sing, not loudly at first, maybe just enough to warm the space. Freedom songs had become one of the movement's most important tools, not because they entertained people, but because they helped people endure fear together. Singing could turn a bus from a vehicle into a congregation. It could steady the nerves before a jail cell, a march, a confrontation, or a long ride into uncertainty. There were older people on some of those buses who had seen more than enough to be cautious. They had lived through years when challenging racial order could bring swift punishment. They had learned how to lower their eyes in the wrong place, when to speak, when not to speak, how to protect children by teaching them rules no child should have to learn. For them, going to Washington may have carried a different feeling than it did for the young. The young often carried urgency in their bodies. They had seen sit-ins work. They had seen students make national news. They had watched courage become contagious. Older marchers might have carried hope more carefully, not because they believed less, but because disappointment had trained them to guard it. On the road to Washington, those generations sat near one another. The movement needed both. Students were another presence on the roads. By 1963, student activists had already changed the pace of the civil rights struggle. The sit-in movement had begun in 1960 with young people refusing to leave segregated lunch counters. The Freedom Rides had tested interstate travel in 1961 and had brought brutal violence onto television screens and newspaper pages. Student organisers in the South had gone into communities where voter registration work was dangerous and slow. They were young, but not inexperienced. Many had already faced jail, beatings, threats, and the kind of fear that leaves a person older than their age. When they travelled to Washington, they did not come as spectators waiting to be inspired by famous men. They came as workers in the movement, and some of them were impatient with the careful tone that national leaders sometimes preferred. That tension travelled too. It rode on buses and trains along with the signs and sandwiches. The March on Washington was unified, but not simple. Some wanted the day to be a firm but respectable appeal to national conscience. Some wanted a sharper confrontation with federal power. Some believed the proposed civil rights bill did not go nearly far enough. Some were frustrated that the language of the platform might be softened to preserve political alliances. This did not mean the march was weak. It meant it was alive. Real movements contain arguments because real people bring different experiences of the same injustice. The discipline of August 28th did not erase those differences. It held them long enough for the country to see a common demand. On trains, the journey had a different feel. Train stations already have a kind of public seriousness to them, especially in the middle of the 20th century, when rail travel still carried the weight of business, migration, military service, and long-distance family travel. People stood on platforms with bags at their feet. Conductors called destinations. Porters moved through the crowd. Groups tried to stay together. A train car gives people more room than a bus, but it also places them in a more public setting, moving through towns and stations where the march could be seen before it arrived. A group boarding for Washington announced itself simply by existing. The clothes, the signs, the conversations, the mood, all made the destination clear. Some people wore their best clothes, and this detail matters. Photographs from the march show men in ties, women in dresses, people dressed as if attending church or a formal civic occasion. This was not vanity. It was strategy, self-respect, habit, and cultural language all at once. In a society that often tried to portray black protest as disorderly or irresponsible, dressing carefully could be a form of argument. It said, "We are citizens." It said, "We know exactly what this day means." It said, "You will not make us small." Of course, not everyone dressed the same. Many wore practical clothing for heat and travel. But the overall dignity of appearance became part of the day's visual power. People understood that cameras would be present. They understood that the nation would look. They dressed for being seen. The roads into Washington grew busier as the morning advanced. Buses came in lines. Cars followed unfamiliar routes. Out-of-town drivers tried to understand the city. Police watched traffic. Volunteers directed groups toward gathering points. The capital had prepared for possible trouble, but what arrived was mostly order. This surprised some observers, though it should not have. The movement had spent years training people in discipline. Churches had trained people in collective ritual. Labour unions had trained people in organised action. Civil rights groups had trained marshals. Families had trained children to behave in public because they knew the consequences of being judged harshly. The crowd did not become peaceful by accident. Peace was work. Now imagine arriving after a long night on the road. Your back hurts, your mouth is dry, your clothes are not as neat as they were when you left. You step down from the bus and feel the heat already beginning to build. Washington, in late August, is not gentle. The air can feel heavy. The sun reflects off stone and pavement. A day outdoors will require patience from the body. You look around for the people you came with, because losing them in a crowd this large would be easy. Someone points toward the mall. Someone else asks where the restrooms are. A marshal gives directions. You begin walking. That first walk into the gathering space must have been one of the most powerful private moments of the day. Before the speeches, before the official march, before the cameras found the most dramatic angles, people had to absorb the fact that others had come in numbers beyond expectation. At first you might see dozens, then hundreds, then more arriving from every direction. Groups carrying signs, clergy in collars, union members with banners, students moving with restless energy, families holding hands, white allies trying to find their delegations, journalists setting up equipment, volunteers passing out materials. The mall, usually a formal public space designed to make individuals feel small before national monuments, began filling with people who refused to be made small. There is something important about the route itself. The marchers gathered near the Washington Monument and moved toward the Lincoln Memorial. Even if a person did not speak in symbolic terms, the setting did a great deal of speaking on its own. The Washington Monument stood for the founding generation and the birth of the Republic. The Lincoln Memorial stood for emancipation, the Civil War, and the unfinished meaning of freedom. Between them lay the reflecting pool and the open space of national memory. The marchers were walking through a landscape that claimed to belong to all Americans, while demanding that the country make that claim true. They were not entering some hidden corner of government. They were entering the country's front yard. Many had come prepared for a march, but the physical movement from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial was only about a mile. The greater journey had already happened. It had happened in the all-night rides, the weeks of organising, the years of struggle, the decades of promises broken. By the time people began moving along the mall, the distance was less important than the visibility. They were not marching because the path was long. They were marching because the path was public. Still, the act of walking mattered. Walking places the body inside the argument. It is slower than a speech and harder to ignore than a letter. Step by step, people made the demand visible. The signs were clear and disciplined. Many had been printed to keep the message unified. They called for civil rights, jobs, fair wages, voting rights, school desegregation, and an end to discrimination. The signs did not ask the viewer to solve a mystery. They stated what the march was about in plain language. That plainness was part of the power. The country did not need a new philosophy to understand the demand. It needed the will to act on principles it already recited. The buses and trains kept feeding the crowd. Some people arrived early enough to find places close to the stage. Others came later and stood far back, where the speakers were small and the sound system mattered more than eyesight. A person in the rear of the crowd might not see the faces clearly, but they could feel the size of the gathering. The heat rose. The reflecting pool stretched beside them. People shifted from foot to foot. They shared water. They fanned themselves with programs. They looked for shade and often found none. Some climbed into trees or onto walls to see better. Others sat when they could. A crowd of that size is not only a political fact, it is a physical environment. It has temperature, pressure, movement, sound, and fatigue. The sound deserves attention. Not the famous sound from the microphones yet, but the sound before the programme fully took hold. Shoes on pavement, buses braking, groups calling out to one another, snatches of song, the low steady murmur of people waiting, instructions from marshals, the rustling of signs, cameras clicking, children asking questions, adults answering in short sentences because they are trying to keep track of everything, the occasional laugh, because even serious days contain small human relief. The crowd was not silent, it was alive. But it was controlled enough that many observers noticed the calm. That calm did not mean people lacked feeling. It meant they had brought their feeling under discipline for the sake of the day. For people who had travelled from the deep south, the sight of so many allies in one place could be overwhelming. In their hometowns, they might have been part of a brave minority facing local hostility. In Washington, the numbers changed the emotional scale. A person who had stood with 50 others outside a courthouse could now stand with hundreds of thousands before a national monument. That does something to the mind. It tells you that your local struggle is part of something larger. It tells you that the danger you faced was not wasted. It tells you that the people who called you troublemakers were wrong, or at least not powerful enough to define the whole story. For those from northern cities, the march also carried recognition. Segregation in the north often wore different clothes than segregation in the south. It could appear through housing discrimination, school boundaries, hiring practices, union exclusion, police treatment, and neighbourhood inequality rather than signs reading white and coloured. Northern marchers did not come only to express sympathy with the South. Many came because their own cities were full of injustice that could not be explained away by pointing below the Mason-Dixon line. The roads to Washington carried both southern and northern grievances, and the march gave them a shared language. Some came by plane, and their arrival tells another part of the story. Air travel in 1963 was not as ordinary or affordable as it later became. Those who flew often represented organisations, leadership groups, distant delegations, or individuals with the means to cross long distances quickly. They entered the day through airports rather than bus lots, but once they reached the mall, they joined the same crowd. The event compressed the country. A person from California, a minister from Georgia, a union member from Michigan, a student from Mississippi, and a rabbi from New York could stand within the same public demand. That compression was one of the march's achievements. For one day, the scattered geography of American injustice became visible in one place. The arrival also required trust. People had to trust organisers they might never meet. They had to trust that transportation would work, that the police would not attack, that the crowd would remain orderly, that the day would not become a disaster, that the money and time spent getting there would matter. Trust is not often listed as a logistical requirement, but it is one. Without trust, buses stay half empty. Without trust, parents keep children home. Without trust, local groups hesitate. The fact that so many people came tells us something about the credibility the movement had built. It tells us that churches, unions, civil rights organisations, and local leaders had persuaded people not only that the cause was right, but that this particular day was worth the risk. There is a smaller detail that should not be missed. Many people arrived carrying food. This was practical, but it also gave the day a particular texture. A paper bag with sandwiches is not the image most history books linger over, but it belongs in the story. Food meant planning. It meant care. It meant someone had thought about the body that would have to stand for hours in the heat. It meant the march was not only organised by famous leaders in offices, but by ordinary people in kitchens. A sandwich made before dawn could be part of a political act. A thermos filled at a sink could help someone remain in place long enough to be counted. Children saw all of this with a clarity adults sometimes underestimate. A child brought to Washington that day would remember fragments, the crowd, the heat, the long ride, the adults acting serious, the songs, the sight of the Lincoln Memorial, the feeling of being told to stay close. Maybe they did not understand the full legislative program or the tensions among civil rights organisations, but they understood that something important was happening because every adult around them behaved as if it were. That is how public memory is transmitted, not only through speeches but through the body of a child, who remembers waking early, riding far, and standing among people who believed the future should be different. By mid-morning, Washington had changed. The city that had prepared for possible disorder was seeing something else. It was seeing order on a scale that was itself a rebuke. It was seeing citizens arrive from across the country not to riot, not to beg, not to disappear into official buildings one by one, but to stand together in open air and make a claim. The buses had done their work, the trains had done their work. The cars and planes had done their work. The walking had begun to gather everyone into one place, and now the crowd was becoming the central fact. Not the platform yet, not the microphones, not the famous sentence that would later define the day in public memory. The crowd itself. The people who had endured the roads, the waiting, the discomfort, the risk and the uncertainty were now standing where the country could see them. They had turned travel into testimony. Every mile behind them had added weight to their presence. A person who comes from across town matters. A person who rides all night matters. A person who crosses several states to stand silently in the heat matters. Together they made distance visible. The roads to Washington did not empty people of their private lives. They brought those lives with them. In the crowd were rent payments due, children starting school, bosses to face the next morning, farms, factories, kitchens, classrooms, church offices, college campuses, grief still fresh, hope still cautious, and fears that had not disappeared simply because the day was peaceful. This is what makes the arrival so moving if you look at it closely. The marchers did not become symbols by ceasing to be ordinary. They became powerful because they remained ordinary and came anyway. As they moved toward the Lincoln Memorial, the scale of the day became harder to deny. The open ground filled. The reflecting pool, usually a place where tourists walk slowly and take photographs, became a long mirror beside a human gathering that stretched farther than any one person could easily comprehend from the ground. Somewhere ahead, the platform waited. The leaders were preparing. The program would begin. But for those in the crowd, the first great event had already happened. They had arrived. They had found one another. They had taken the private decision made in kitchens, churches, union halls, dorm rooms, and late-night meetings and turned it into public presence. The next thing was to stand there inside that presence and feel what it meant. Not from a newspaper photograph taken from above, not from the clean distance of historical memory, from the ground, from the middle of the heat and noise and bodies, from the place where the stage looked small, the crowd looked endless, and the person beside you might be a stranger who had travelled hundreds of miles for the same reason you had. From the place where the stage looked small, the crowd looked endless, and the person beside you might be a stranger who had travelled hundreds of miles for the same reason you had. The March on Washington was not yet a monument in national memory. It was not a quotation printed in a school book. It was not a black and white photograph with a neat caption underneath. It was a living, moving, sweating crowd in late August, standing under the Washington sun, trying to hear, trying to see, trying to stay together, and trying to understand the size of what was happening while it was happening. That is harder than it sounds. People who live through historic days do not usually know exactly how those days will be remembered. They know what the air feels like. They know whether their feet hurt. They know if they can hear the speaker or if the sound is fading in and out. They know whether the person beside them is singing, praying, laughing, fanning themselves with a program, or wiping sweat from the back of their neck. They know the small frustrations of being in a crowd. Someone stands too close. Someone blocks the view. Someone is trying to find a friend. Someone has lost the group they came with. Someone is hungry but does not want to move because the place they found is too good to give up. History, from the inside, is often much more physical than we allow it to be later. The first thing many people would have felt was the heat. Washington, D.C., in late August, can make even standing still feel like work. The air is not simply warm. It holds onto the body. It sits in the collar of a shirt and under the brim of a hat. It rises from the pavement and stone. It makes the distance between shade and no shade feel much larger than it is. People are dressed carefully for the day, many of them in suits, ties, dresses, church shoes, hats and gloves, because they understood that they were presenting themselves to the nation. But dignity can be hot. A dark suit under the August sun does not care that history is being made. A pair of good shoes does not become comfortable because the cause is righteous. A woman who had chosen her dress the night before still had to stand in it for hours. A man who had polished his shoes still had to feel the pavement through the soles. A child brought along so they would remember the day still became thirsty, restless, and tired like any child in a crowd, and yet people stayed. That is one of the most important things to notice. They stayed. They stood in the sun. They sat where they could. They leaned against trees, walls, and one another. They found small patches of shade and shared them. They passed water. They opened paper bags and ate the food they had brought from home. They looked toward the Lincoln Memorial, where the platform had been built, and tried to connect the distant figures on the steps with the voices coming through the sound system. For many people, the leaders were too far away to see clearly. Dr. King, A. Philip Randolph, John Lewis, Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young, Walter Reuther, Mahalia Jackson, and the others on the program may have appeared as small forms against the white stone. But the distance did not make them unimportant. It made the crowd itself feel even larger. If you could not see the face of the speaker, you could still hear the reaction moving through the people around you. Applause travelled, murmurs travelled, songs travelled. A phrase caught by one section of the crowd could pass backward through thousands of bodies until even those far from the microphones understood that something had landed. The sound system mattered more than most people think. A crowd that size depends on sound. Without it, people at the back are not participants in the same way. They become observers of other people participating. The organisers knew this. They had arranged for speakers, wires, microphones and broadcast equipment, all of it necessary to turn a gathering into a shared experience. There was even concern before the march when the sound system was tampered with and it had to be repaired in time. That is the sort of detail that rarely survives in the easy version of the story, but it mattered that morning. Imagine coming all the way to Washington, standing among hundreds of thousands of people and not being able to hear. The day depended on voices carrying, but even before the formal speeches took hold, there was sound everywhere. The low, constant murmur of a huge crowd has its own character. It is not like a small room where you can separate one conversation from another. It becomes a living background. A woman asking her group to stay close. A man calling out the name of a city when he spots friends from home. A child asking how long it will be. A volunteer giving directions. The rustle of signs. The click of cameras. The shifting of shoes. The sudden rise of a song from one part of the mall and then another. Freedom songs had a special force in that crowd because many people already knew them. They were not performances in the ordinary sense. They were tools. They had been sung in churches, mass meetings, jail cells, buses, marches and outside courthouses. They helped people keep time. They helped people steady themselves. They turned fear into breath. There is a reason singing was so central to the civil rights movement. A song can do what a speech cannot always do. It can be shared instantly. It does not require everyone to agree on every political detail. It lets the frightened person borrow courage from the person beside them. It lets a crowd hear itself. When people sang "We Shall Overcome," they were not making a casual statement of optimism. They were repeating a promise, sometimes against evidence, sometimes through grief, sometimes with the kind of discipline that comes from knowing that hope has to be practiced, or it weakens. In Washington, those songs moved across a space usually reserved for official ceremonies and tourists. They filled the National Mall with the sound of people who had not been invited into full citizenship, asking for it anyway. Now, look at the signs. Many of them were printed in a consistent style, because the organisers wanted discipline and clarity. This was not a day for every slogan anyone could think of. The message had to be controlled enough that newspapers, television cameras, politicians and hostile observers could not pretend to misunderstand it. The signs spoke about civil rights, jobs, voting, decent housing, fair employment, school desegregation, and equal treatment. Some said, "We march for jobs for all now." Some said, "We demand voting rights now." Some called for an end to police brutality. Others asked for a federal fair employment practices law. These were not decorative signs. They were demands held at shoulder height. To stand in that crowd was to stand inside an argument that had been carefully prepared. The people around you were not only expressing feeling, they were pressing a specific case. They wanted civil rights legislation. They wanted enforcement. They wanted economic opportunity. They wanted the federal government to stop treating racial justice as a local inconvenience and start treating it as a national obligation. The signs made that clear even to someone watching from a distance. Aerial photographs show a mass of people, but on the ground the message was readable one placard at a time. There were famous people in the crowd and on the platform, and their presence mattered. Actors, musicians, writers, religious leaders, union leaders, and public figures came to lend their names, faces, and voices to the march. But the true power of the day did not come from celebrity. It came from scale and seriousness. A famous singer could help draw attention, but the force of the event came from the ordinary people who had taken the trouble to be there. The nurses, students, teachers, porters, factory workers, ministers, barbers, secretaries, maids, cooks, railroad workers, office clerks, parents, children, retirees, and veterans. People who would return home to regular life after the march, carrying the memory of having stood in a place where regular life had briefly become national history. That is one of the strange things about a mass gathering. Each person is both small and necessary. If you are standing in the middle of 250,000 people, you may feel almost invisible. No one far away can see your face. No newspaper will print your name. The speaker on the platform does not know you are there. And yet the crowd would not be the crowd without all those single bodies added together. The number matters because each person chose to enter it. One person from a church group, one person from a union local, one student from a campus, one mother, one father, one child, one person who had been quiet for years and decided that this time they would be visible. The march turned private conviction into public quantity. There must have been moments when people simply looked around. Not because there was anything official to watch, but because the crowd itself was the sight. From the ground, a crowd that large does not reveal itself all at once. You see the people around you first, then the rows beyond them, then signs farther back, then more people beyond the signs, then movement near the reflecting pool, then people on the steps, near the trees, along the edges, everywhere the eye can settle. It becomes difficult to measure. You stop counting and start understanding differently. You understand through your body, through the delay between a cheer starting near the front and reaching the place where you stand, through the time it takes to move a few yards, through the difficulty of finding anyone once separated, through the knowledge that all these people came for the same day and the same demand. For black marchers who had grown up under segregation, that sight could carry a meaning deeper than simple numbers. In many towns, segregation worked partly by making people feel isolated. It told them the system was permanent. It told them that resistance was dangerous and perhaps futile. It told them that white power controlled the courthouse, the school board, the police station, the bank, the newspaper, and the hiring office. It made change feel far away. But in Washington, the numbers told a different story. They did not erase fear. They did not pass a law by themselves, but they contradicted isolation. They said, look how many of us there are. Look how many people are willing to stand. Look how many have stopped accepting the old answers. For white allies in the crowd, the experience could be different but also important. Some had worked in the movement for years and knew the risks well. Others were newer, drawn by Birmingham, by church appeals, by unions, by conscience, by friends, or by the growing sense that neutrality had become impossible. Standing in that crowd required them to see civil rights not as a Southern problem, not as a black problem, not as an unfortunate issue for experts and politicians, but as a national question in which they too had a role. The march placed people beside one another who did not share the same daily risk, but who could share the same public demand. That did not solve the deeper inequalities inside American life. It did create a visible coalition at a moment when visibility mattered. The mood was serious, but not lifeless. This is important because solemnity is often mistaken for sadness. People were not standing there as if at a funeral, even though grief was part of the day. They were not attending a festival, even though there was music and reunion. The mood sat somewhere between church service, labour rally, family gathering, national ceremony and protest. People smiled. People embraced. People sang. People listened closely. People took photographs. People grew tired. People joked in small ways because human beings do that even in serious moments. A person can be committed to justice and still complain about the heat. A person can be part of history and still wonder where to find water. These ordinary details do not weaken the story. They make it true. The discipline of the crowd impressed many observers, but it should not be treated as accidental politeness. It was cultivated. Marshals moved through the crowd and along the route. They wore identifying armbands or caps and were trained to keep order without creating tension. They helped direct people, manage movement and respond to problems. The organisers understood that a peaceful crowd of 250,000 people still needed structure. People faint. People get separated. People become frustrated. Rumours start. A hostile person can provoke conflict. A medical emergency can create panic if no one knows what to do. Order is not simply the absence of violence, it is the presence of preparation. There was also the constant awareness of being watched. The marchers knew cameras were there. They knew reporters were there. They knew the White House and Congress would pay attention. They knew opponents were waiting to interpret the day in the worst possible light. That knowledge shaped behaviour. People understood that their bodies were not only present, they were being read. A man adjusting his tie, a woman standing calmly in the heat, a student holding a sign, a minister singing, a child looking toward the memorial, all of it could become part of how the country understood the movement. This is a heavy burden. To protest injustice and also have to prove your respectability to people who doubt you is exhausting. But the marchers carried that burden because they knew the image of the day would matter. Near the reflecting pool, the setting gave the crowd a visual order that no indoor hall could have created. Water, stone, trees, sky, and monuments formed the background. The Lincoln Memorial stood ahead with its columns and steps, a building designed to make memory feel permanent. Inside sat the statue of Lincoln, larger than life, calm in the way stone is calm. It had been 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. That anniversary was not a footnote. It was part of the argument. A century after formal emancipation, hundreds of thousands of Americans had come to say that freedom remained unfinished. The place made that argument without needing to explain it. Some people stood in the water of the reflecting pool to cool their feet. That small detail says a great deal about the day. Formal national spaces are usually treated with distance. You look, you walk, you behave as a visitor. But the crowd that day made them all a lived-in space. People had travelled too far and stood too long to remain untouched by heat. Shoes came off. Feet entered the water. The body insisted on being part of the record. History does not always happen in clean lines. Sometimes it happens with aching feet in a public pool while a speech echoes across the mall. As the programme continued, people had to listen through distance and interruption. From close to the stage, the speeches had faces. Farther back, they were voices. Farther still, they may have been fragments carried by speakers and crowd response. A person might not catch every word. They might hear applause and then ask someone nearby what had been said. They might remember the feeling more clearly than the details. This is another way history differs from recordings. We can now replay speeches clearly, read transcripts, pause and analyse each sentence. Many who were there received the words under imperfect conditions with heat, noise, fatigue and distance between them and the microphone. Yet the power of the day reached them anyway because the experience was larger than any one speech. That does not mean the speeches were secondary. They were central. But before the most famous speech, the crowd had already become a statement. Speakers addressed not an empty space waiting to be filled with meaning, but a living proof of the demands being made. When A. Philip Randolph spoke, he was not only speaking to officials through the press, he was speaking to a crowd that embodied the cause he had spent decades advancing. When Labour leaders spoke about jobs, they spoke to workers who understood the subject in their own paychecks. When civil rights leaders spoke about voting, education and discrimination, they spoke to people who had brought those realities with them. The crowd was not passive. It supplied the truth the speeches named. Imagine standing there and realising that the person beside you may have come from a completely different America than the one you know. A northern city with crowded neighbourhoods and discriminatory housing. A southern town where voting was dangerous. A college campus where students were testing segregation one sit-in at a time. A union hall where workers debated whether civil rights was also a labour issue. A church where the march had been announced from the pulpit. The crowd was not one story. It was thousands of stories standing close enough to hear the same speakers. There were also people in that crowd who had lost someone or feared losing someone. Medgar Evers had been murdered only weeks earlier. Others had been beaten, jailed, threatened or fired. The violence of the era was not theoretical. It moved through memory as people stood there. A peaceful day does not cancel the danger that made peace necessary. Some marchers may have looked around and felt relief that the warnings of disorder were not coming true. Others may have remained alert, unable to fully relax. That alertness is part of the story too. You can stand in a calm crowd and still carry the knowledge that calm is fragile. For all the planning, the crowd also created moments no organiser could script. A song beginning unexpectedly, a stranger sharing water, someone lifting a child so they could see, people cheering a line from a speaker before the full sentence has even settled, a group from one city recognising a group from another, the small nod exchange between strangers who know they are on the same side. These moments rarely enter official histories because they do not change legislation directly, but they change how people remember their own participation. They are the texture of belonging. Belonging was not a small thing for people who had been systematically excluded. The federal buildings around them belonged to the nation. The monuments belonged to the nation. The language of the Declaration and the Constitution belonged to the nation. But many Americans had been forced to live as if the word nation meant someone else first. Standing on the Mall challenged that. It said this space is ours too, not as guests, not as petitioners allowed in for the day, as citizens. That claim was physical. It was made by feet on the ground, voices in the air, bodies in the heat, and signs held high enough to be seen. A person in the crowd might have felt pride, but also impatience. Pride at the size and discipline of the gathering. Impatience because the demands were not new. Pride at seeing so many people together. Impatience because people had suffered too long for rights already owed. Pride at the setting. Impatience with the politicians who would return to committees and procedures after the crowd went home. This mixture matters. The day was not only inspiring, it was pressuring. The crowd did not gather merely to feel good about itself. It gathered to make delay harder. By afternoon, fatigue would have been real. The body can only stand so long before history becomes heavy in the knees and back. People shifted, sat, rose again, fanned themselves, checked on companions, rationed water, looked for shade, listened, waited. There is a discipline in remaining present after the first excitement wears off. Anyone can be moved by arrival. It takes something steadier to remain through hours of heat and speeches. The crowd did that too. It endured the day physically, and that endurance became part of the message. They were not going to leave before being counted fully. If you could move through the crowd slowly, which would have been difficult, you would not hear one single version of the day. You would hear different accents, different ages, different expectations. A minister explaining the meaning of the event to a young person. A student arguing quietly about whether the demands were strong enough. A mother telling a child to drink water. A union member talking about wages. Someone from Mississippi describing conditions back home. Someone from New York saying the North has its own work to do. Someone asking when Dr. King is supposed to speak. Someone else saying they just hope Congress is watching. This is what democracy sounded like on the ground that day. Not tidy agreement, but shared pressure. And through all of it, the Lincoln Memorial remained ahead. It is easy now to see that setting is inevitable, as if the speech and the place had always belonged together. But for those present, the memorial was not yet fixed to the words that would soon be spoken there. It was a backdrop, a symbol, a meeting point, a large white structure with steps and columns where the leader stood. Its meaning would deepen as the day went on. The crowd would help make that meaning. A monument is stone until people gather around it and insist that the past has business with the present. What it felt like to stand in that crowd then was not one feeling. It was heat and thirst. It was pride and worry. It was songs and speeches. It was sore feet and straight backs. It was the shock of numbers. It was the comfort of not being alone. It was the pressure of being watched. It was the private memory of insults carried into public space. It was the knowledge that some people at home were waiting to hear how it went. It was the awareness that the day might matter, without knowing exactly how much. It was ordinary discomfort joined to extraordinary purpose. And as the programme moved forward, the crowd kept listening. They had already heard music and prayers. They had heard organisers and leaders speak from long years of work. They had heard demands for jobs, voting rights, decent housing, desegregated schools and federal action. Some speeches stirred them. Some challenged them. Some sharpened the purpose of the day. The famous moment had not yet arrived, but the air had been prepared by everything before it. The travel, the waiting, the heat, the songs, the signs, the disciplined presence of 250,000 people who had come to Washington not simply to witness history, but to force the country to face what had made the march necessary. The famous moment had not yet arrived, but the air had been prepared by everything before it. The travel, the waiting, the heat, the songs, the signs, the disciplined presence of 250,000 people who had come to Washington not simply to witness history, but to force the country to face what had made the march necessary. Before Martin Luther King Jr. stepped fully into the memory of the nation, other voices had already taken their place at the microphone. Some were older voices shaped by decades of labour organising. Some were younger voices carrying the impatience of students who had already gone to jail for the movement. Some came from churches, unions, civil rights organisations and religious communities. Each speaker added a different kind of pressure to the day. This is important because the March on Washington is often remembered as if everything before King was only an introduction. That is not how the day worked for the people standing there. They had not travelled hundreds of miles only to wait for one sentence. They had come for a full public case against racial injustice. They had come to hear the demands spoken clearly from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. They had come to hear leaders say in public what many people had been saying in kitchens, church basements, union halls, school meetings, jail cells, and street protests for years. The speeches before the dream were not background noise. They were the foundation under the moment that later became famous. The programme at the Lincoln Memorial had been carefully arranged. It had to represent the organisations that sponsored the march, the religious support behind it, the labour support behind it, and the different wings of the civil rights movement that did not always agree on tactics. That alone was difficult. A day that looks unified from the outside often contains many negotiations behind the scenes. Who speaks first? Who speaks last? How long each person gets? Which demands are emphasised? Which phrases are considered too sharp? Which people are included? Which people are left out? By the time the crowd heard the official voices from the platform, many arguments had already taken place out of view. The programme began with ceremony. The national anthem was scheduled to be led by Marian Anderson, whose own history gave the day a special resonance. In 1939, Anderson had sung from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial after being denied the use of Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution because she was black. The earlier concert had drawn a large crowd and had turned the same memorial into a stage for dignity against exclusion. In 1963, Anderson was again connected to the Lincoln Memorial, again connected to a public challenge against racial barriers. But even ceremonies do not always run as planned. She was delayed, and Camilla Williams, another black classical singer of great talent, led the anthem instead. It was a small adjustment in the schedule, but not a small detail. The day had to keep moving. History rarely waits for perfect timing. Then came prayer. Archbishop Patrick O'Boyle of Washington gave the invocation. His presence signalled the role of religious institutions in the event, but it also showed how carefully the march had been shaped for national legitimacy. This was not a gathering that wanted to appear careless or uncontrolled. It opened with the anthem and with prayer in front of a monument to Lincoln under the eyes of the press, with the federal government watching closely. The formality mattered. It told the country that the marchers were not outside American civic life. They were standing at the centre of it, using its symbols, its rituals and its language to demand that the country honour its own claims. Philip Randolph gave the opening remarks, and that was fitting because the march had deep roots in his long work. Randolph was not a new figure pushed forward by the excitement of 1963. He had been organising black workers for decades. He had led the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a union built by men who worked on trains serving passengers who often treated them as invisible. He had threatened a march on Washington back in 1941 to protest discrimination in defence industries, and that threat had helped pressure President Franklin Roosevelt into issuing an order against racial discrimination in defence work. Randolph understood that mass pressure could move presidents. He had learned that lesson long before many in the 1963 crowd were born. By the time Randolph stood before the crowd in 1963, he was an elder of the movement. His voice carried the weight of age, labour and persistence. He represented a bridge between the older struggle for fair employment and the newer urgency of sit-ins, freedom rides and direct action. For Randolph, jobs and freedom were not separate slogans printed together for convenience. They were connected at the root. A person denied decent work was not fully free. A person excluded from unions, factories, offices and fair wages was being denied citizenship in practical terms, even if the law claimed otherwise. Randolph's opening words placed the march inside that older economic fight. He was reminding the crowd that the demand was not only for better treatment in public spaces, it was for the material conditions that make freedom real. A crowd listening to Randolph would have included people who understood the point without needing explanation, men who had been passed over for work, women who had cleaned houses for wages too low to support a family, young people who wondered whether education would truly open doors if employers kept them closed, workers from northern cities where discrimination was not written on signs but still shaped hiring, southern sharecroppers who knew that trying to register to vote could cost a family its land or livelihood. Randolph spoke to all of that. His presence made clear that the day belonged not only to moral appeal, but also to labour history. The platform then turned toward a tribute to black women who had fought for freedom. This part of the programme carries both honour and discomfort. Women had done essential work in the civil rights movement. They had organised meetings, led local campaigns, taught young activists, raised money, cooked, typed, travelled, faced arrest, endured threats, and in many cases held communities together when men were jailed, fired, beaten or killed. Rosa Parks, Daisy Bates, Diane Nash, Gloria Richardson, Merle Evers, and others were not symbolic helpers. They were central to the movement. Yet the official speaking programme gave women only limited space. The absence of a major woman speaker was not an accident no one noticed. Women leaders noticed. They objected. Anna Arnold Hedgeman and Dorothy Height, among others, pushed for better representation. What they received was a tribute, not equal time. Daisy Bates spoke briefly during that tribute. She had helped guide the Little Rock Nine through the crisis of integrating Central High School in Arkansas in 1957, when children had faced mobs, threats, and the need for federal protection just to attend school. Bates knew what public courage looked like when it was demanded of the young. Her presence at the march connected the day to the school desegregation battles that followed Brown versus Board of Education. She also stood there in a complicated position. She was honoured, but not given the kind of central speaking role that male leaders received. That contradiction belongs in the story. The March on Washington was a great moment for justice, and it still carried the gender limitations of its time. A serious history has to hold both facts at once. The women recognised that Day represented different parts of the struggle. Rosa Parks had become a national symbol after the Montgomery bus boycott, but she was also a long-time activist with deep roots in organising. Diane Nash had been one of the most important student leaders of the sit-in movement and the Freedom Rides. Gloria Richardson had led a movement in Cambridge, Maryland, where demands included not only desegregation but jobs and housing. Merle Evers carried the fresh grief of Medgar Evers' assassination. These women were not minor figures standing near the edge of someone else's movement. They had earned the right to speak. The fact that the programme did not fully reflect that tells us something about 1963, not only about what the movement challenged, but about what it had not yet fully corrected within itself. After that came religious voices. Eugene Carson Blake, a Protestant leader, spoke as part of the wider religious support for civil rights. The civil rights movement drew heavily from black churches, but it also sought support from white Protestant, Catholic and Jewish leaders willing to stand publicly against segregation. That support mattered because segregationists often claimed religious authority for their own side. They defended racial order from pulpits, quoted scripture, and insisted that change was outside agitation. Religious leaders on the platform at Washington challenged that claim. They said in effect that conscience did not belong only to the defenders of tradition. Faith could stand with protest. Churches and synagogues could not speak about justice in theory, while remaining silent about discrimination in practice. Then John Lewis came to the microphone. He was only 23 years old. That fact should stop us for a moment. 23 is young. At 23, many people are still trying to decide what kind of life they want. Lewis had already become national chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He had already been beaten and arrested. He had already taken part in a movement that demanded more from young people than most adults ever face. When he stood at the Lincoln Memorial, he did not speak with the caution of an elder balancing many alliances. He spoke with the urgency of someone whose generation had been placing their bodies in danger and was tired of being told to wait. Lewis's speech had caused serious concern before he gave it. His original draft was stronger than what the crowd eventually heard. It criticised the Kennedy administration's civil rights bill as too weak and used language that some march leaders and allies thought could damage the day. There were objections from Archbishop O'Boyle, Walter Reuther, and others. Behind the scenes, Lewis was pressured to revise it. That kind of pressure shows the tension at the heart of the march. The day needed unity, but unity sometimes required young activists to soften words that came from real anger. Lewis did revise the speech, but even in revised form it remained one of the sharpest addresses of the day. He spoke about people who were not present because they could not afford to come. or because they were working for starvation wages. He spoke of jailed activists, of sharecroppers, of people facing danger for trying to vote. He warned that the proposed civil rights legislation did not yet do enough. He asked where the political party was that would make marches unnecessary, and at one point he made the demand plain: freedom now, not eventually, not after another committee, not after another season of patience, now. For the crowd, especially the younger activists and those from the most dangerous parts of the South, Lewis's words must have sounded like the pressure they carried in their own chests. The difference between Lewis and some of the older leaders was not simply anger versus calm. It was a difference in position. Older leaders had long experience negotiating with presidents, building institutions, managing coalitions, and trying to win legislation. Younger activists had been sitting at counters, going to jail, facing police dogs, and trying to register voters in places where federal protection often seemed distant or inadequate. Both experiences were real, both had value, but they did not always produce the same language. Lewis brought the street, the jail cell, and the rural courthouse into the official program. He reminded the audience that the march was not only a respectable gathering in Washington, it was connected to places where the cost of activism was being paid that very week. Walter Reuther followed as a Labour leader, president of the United Auto Workers. His presence mattered because the march was not only a civil rights event in the narrow sense, it was also a labour event. Reuther represented union support, especially from industrial workers. The UAW had provided money and organising help. That support helped demonstrate that the demand for civil rights was connected to the demand for economic justice. Reuther's role also showed that parts of organised labour recognised segregation and discrimination as threats to workers as a whole. Not all labour organisations were equally committed. Some unions had their own histories of exclusion. The larger AF-CIO had remained officially neutral, but the presence of Reuther and union members in the crowd showed that Labour could not honestly speak of worker dignity while ignoring racial discrimination. Then came the voice of CORE through Floyd McKissick, who read remarks because James Farmer, the head of the Congress of Racial Equality, was in jail in Louisiana. That absence was itself a message. Farmer was not missing because of illness or scheduling. He was imprisoned as part of the struggle. So when McKissick read for him, the crowd was reminded that the movement's leaders were not all safely assembled in Washington. Some were behind bars. The platform did not stand apart from the risks of the movement. It was connected to them. The empty place where Farmer might have stood told its own story. Between speeches, music helped carry the program. Choirs and singers gave the crowd a way to breathe between demands. Mahalia Jackson, one of the greatest gospel singers of the 20th century, was part of the day's sound. Her voice had the authority of church, grief, endurance, and command. Music at the march was not decoration added to make the event pleasant. It belonged to the movement's method. Songs had been used in mass meetings, jail cells, and marches because they could organise feeling without needing a printed agenda. They reminded people why they had come and helped them endure the waiting. Whitney Young of the National Urban League spoke as another member of the major civil rights leadership. Young represented an organisation often associated with employment, professional advancement, urban issues, and negotiation with business and government. His presence placed another part of Black America on the stage: the struggle for access to jobs, housing, training, and the institutions of city life. Civil rights was not only about dramatic confrontations in the South, it was also about whether Black Americans in northern and western cities could move into decent housing, get fair work, and share in the economic growth that many white Americans had come to see as normal after World War II. Matthew Achman from the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice represented Catholic support for the march. Rabbi Uri Miller offered a prayer. Rabbi Joachim Prince later spoke as president of the American Jewish Congress. Prince had fled Nazi Germany, and his presence gave the day another historical layer. He knew what state-backed hatred and public silence could become. When he spoke in Washington, He brought a memory from Europe into an American civil rights gathering. His argument was not that the histories were identical. They were not. His presence mattered because he understood the danger of people watching injustice and calling their silence neutrality. For many in the crowd, hearing Jewish leaders stand against segregation reinforced the idea that civil rights was not a narrow interest. It was a test of the nation's moral life. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP also spoke before King. Wilkins represented one of the oldest and most important civil rights organisations in the country. The NAACP had spent decades fighting through the courts, public advocacy, membership organising and legislative pressure. It had played a central role in the legal campaign against school segregation. Wilkins's approach was often measured and institutional, but that did not mean weak. The legal victories of the civil rights movement had required patience, skill, money, and persistence over many years. When Wilkins stood at the memorial, he carried that legal tradition with him. He represented the side of the movement that had spent years building cases, gathering evidence, and forcing the law to confront its own contradictions. The range of speakers mattered because the movement itself was not one thing. It was legal strategy and direct action. It was church leadership and student rebellion. It was labour organising and voter registration. It was northern housing fights and southern desegregation campaigns. It was older leaders who knew how to negotiate, and younger activists who knew the cost of delay. It was black institutions and interracial alliances. The speeches before King showed that range. They also showed the difficulty of keeping it together. A large coalition is powerful because it brings many forces into one place. It is difficult because those forces do not always want the same tone, the same pace, or the same compromise. And the crowd heard all of this while standing in the heat. That matters. These speeches were not delivered in a quiet hall where every word could be studied in comfort. They were delivered outdoors to people who had been travelling, walking, waiting, sweating, searching for water, keeping track of children, and listening through distance. Some heard every word, some heard only parts, some responded when the section around them responded. For the people at the back, the day may have been less about following each line and more about sensing the movement of the programme as a whole. A demand would rise from the speakers, the crowd would answer, applause would move outward, and the meaning of the day would settle a little more firmly. The official demands were always near the surface. A strong civil rights bill, desegregation of schools, protection of voting rights, fair employment, decent housing, a federal works programme, a higher minimum wage. These demands made the march harder to reduce to a mood. It was not only hope, it was not only unity. It was not only a wish for brotherhood, it was a political programme. The speeches before the dream made that clear. They said that injustice had specific forms and therefore required specific action. If schools were segregated, they had to be desegregated. If voting was blocked, voting had to be protected. If jobs were denied, employment discrimination had to be outlawed. If people were poor, work and wages had to be addressed. The country was being asked not only to feel differently, but to govern differently. As the afternoon moved forward, each speaker left something in the air. Randolph left the authority of long labour struggle. Bates left the reminder of women's work and the unfinished issue of women's recognition inside the movement. Lewis left urgency. Reuther left labour solidarity. Farmer's words, carried by McKissick, left the fact of jail and direct action. Young left the urban and economic case. Wilkins left the weight of legal struggle. Prins left the warning against silence. The prayers and songs left the sound of moral seriousness. None of these voices was accidental. Together they made the platform into a map of the movement. By the time King's turn approached, the crowd had already been instructed, challenged, steadied, and reminded why it had come. The day had not been waiting empty for him. It had been building. The audience had heard the language of work, law, faith, youth, sacrifice, voting, wages, public accommodations, police violence, and national responsibility. The famous speech would enter that prepared space. It would not float above the march as something separate. It would draw strength from everything already said and everything already carried by the people standing there. A person in the crowd may not have known that this next speech would become the one remembered above all others. They may have known King was an important speaker, of course. He was already one of the best-known leaders in the movement. Many had come wanting to hear him. But they did not know they were about to hear a speech that would be replayed for generations. They did not know which lines would become part of American memory. They did not know that schoolchildren decades later would hear a few sentences from this day, often without hearing the harder demands that surrounded them. They were simply waiting for the next speaker in a long, hot program that had already asked much of their bodies and attention. On the platform, the order of the program was moving toward its final major address. The microphones were ready. The crowd was still gathered along the reflecting pool. The Lincoln Memorial stood behind the speakers with a seated figure of Lincoln inside, silent and enormous. The Washington Monument rose in the distance. The people had listened to leaders tell them why the march mattered. They had heard demands that were concrete, urgent, and national. They had heard the movement speak in many voices. Now the preacher from Atlanta was about to step forward and give those demands a form that millions of people would remember, even if they later forgot how much had already been said before he began. Now the preacher from Atlanta was about to step forward and give those demands a form that millions of people would remember, even if they later forgot how much had already been said before he began. Martin Luther King Jr. did not walk to the microphone as an unknown man. By August of 1963, he was already one of the most visible figures in the civil rights movement. He had led during the Montgomery bus boycott. He had preached in churches and spoken in mass meetings. He had been arrested. He had written from jail. He had faced threats against his life and against his family. He had become familiar to television viewers, newspaper readers, presidents, ministers, students, critics, supporters, and enemies. When he stepped forward at the Lincoln Memorial, people in the crowd knew they were about to hear a serious speaker. What they did not know was that the next few minutes would become one of the most replayed public moments in American history. He stood in a place that carried more meaning than any stage designer could have built. Behind him was the Lincoln Memorial, with Abraham Lincoln seated inside the stone chamber, large and silent. In front of him stretched the reflecting pool, the Washington Monument, and a crowd so large that no single person on the platform could see all of it clearly. The people closest to him could watch his face and gestures. The people far away had to rely on the sound system and on the reactions around them. Television cameras were positioned to carry the speech beyond the mall, into homes, offices, newsrooms, and places where people who had not come to Washington would still experience some part of the day. A speech in that setting was never going to belong only to the people present. It was being delivered to the crowd, to the government, to the press, to the country, and to history, though history had not yet decided what it would keep. King had prepared for the speech. That matters because the later story sometimes makes it sound as if the entire address arrived by inspiration alone. He had worked with advisors. He had drawn on themes he had used before. He had spoken about the American dream in earlier speeches. He had used the idea of freedom ringing from mountainsides before. He had returned often to the contrast between America's stated ideals and its treatment of black citizens. The speech he brought to the podium had roots. It was not a random burst of brilliance disconnected from years of preaching, writing, study, revision, and repetition. King was a gifted speaker, but gifted speakers are also workers. They learn cadences, they test images, they hear what moves a congregation and what does not. They revise as they go. They remember. That is one reason the speech could sound both prepared and alive. King was not reading a cold essay to a crowd. He was drawing from a storehouse of language that had been shaped in churches, movement meetings, and public addresses over many years. A preacher learns to listen while speaking. He listens to the crowd's breathing, to its silence, to the timing of applause, to the moment when a phrase has landed and the next phrase must rise. King had that skill. He did not simply deliver words, he measured the air. The beginning of the address was historical and legal. He placed the march in relation to Lincoln and emancipation. He reminded the nation that a century had passed since the promise of freedom had been made in the shadow of the Civil War. But he did not let the country hide in commemoration. He made the anniversary uncomfortable. 100 years later, black Americans were still not free in the full sense. This was the basic tension of the speech. America had symbols of freedom everywhere. It had monuments, founding documents, patriotic songs, public ceremonies, and schoolbook language. But for millions of people, those symbols did not match daily life. King's task was to hold the symbols up beside the facts and make the difference visible. He used the language of debt. This was one of the speech's most important early arguments, and it was not accidental. The image came partly from discussions with Clarence Jones, one of King's advisers. The country had issued a promise through its founding documents, a promise of rights and equality. Black Americans had come to claim what was owed. The federal government, and the nation more broadly, had failed to honour that obligation. This was a powerful image because it changed the moral position of the marchers. They were not begging. They were not asking for charity. They were presenting a claim. A country that praises contracts, property, law, and obligation could understand the idea of a debt unpaid. For people in the crowd, this language would have made immediate sense. They knew what it meant to be owed something and not receive it. They knew what it meant to work and be underpaid, to serve and be disrespected, to fight in wars and return to second-class citizenship, to pay taxes and be denied equal schools, to be told that freedom was already theirs while every ordinary day proved that it was not. King took that lived experience and placed it in a national frame. He made the injustice sound not like an unfortunate failure of local custom, but like a default on the country's own promise. Then he moved into urgency. This was not a speech about gradual improvement. It did not ask the crowd to be satisfied with symbolic progress. King warned against the slow drug of delay, against being told to cool off, wait, accept half measures, and trust time to solve what people had refused to solve. That part of the speech matters because King is often remembered only through the gentler memory of the dream. But on that day he was also forceful. He spoke as a man who knew that patience could be used as a weapon against the oppressed. He understood that those in power often praised moderation when what they really wanted was silence. He did not call for violence. He did not encourage hatred. But he did insist that the moment was urgent and that the movement would not be satisfied with small gestures. This is where the crowd and the speaker met each other. King was not inventing urgency for them. He was naming what they had brought with them. The people standing along the reflecting pool had travelled because delay had become intolerable. They had not come for a pleasant reminder that progress was slowly unfolding. They had come because people were being beaten, jailed, denied the vote, denied work, denied decent schools, denied equal public treatment, and asked to remain polite while asking again. When King spoke of urgency, he was not pushing the crowd beyond itself. He was giving public language to the decision that had already put them on the buses and trains. He also spoke about discipline. That is another part of the speech that can be overlooked if the dream section is the only part remembered. King warned against bitterness and hatred. He insisted that the struggle had to remain on a high plane of dignity and discipline. This was not soft language. It was movement strategy and moral conviction together. Non-violence was not passivity. It required training, restraint, courage, and the refusal to let opponents determine the character of the protest. Many in the crowd understood that directly. Some had faced insults during sit-ins. Some had been arrested. Some had watched police use force against children in Birmingham. Some had every reason to hate the people who defended segregation. King was not asking them to pretend the injuries were small. He was asking them to carry those injuries without becoming what the movement opposed. That was an enormous demand. It is easy to admire non-violence from a distance. It is harder to imagine practicing it when a police dog is lunging, when a jail door closes, when a child is humiliated, when a voter is turned away, when a church is bombed, when a neighbour is killed, when the system tells you that your anger is the problem rather than the injustice that produced it. King's speech stood inside that difficulty. He was not speaking to people without anger. He was speaking to people whose anger had been disciplined into action. As he continued, he described the interdependence of black and white Americans. He rejected the idea that freedom could belong to one group while another remained oppressed. This was not only a moral statement, it was a warning about the structure of the country. Segregation damaged the whole nation, not equally, not in the same way, but deeply. A democracy that denied rights to millions could not remain morally healthy. A society that taught children racial hierarchy could not avoid poisoning its own civic life. The freedom of black Americans and the future of American democracy were tied together. The marchers knew this. The country needed to hear it. King's delivery had a controlled rhythm. He built phrases in sequences, returning to a word or structure, letting repetition gather force. This was one of his great rhetorical gifts. Repetition in a speech can become dull if it only repeats. But in King's voice, repetition climbed. It gave the crowd a place to enter. It made the argument easier to feel and remember. Each return to a phrase added pressure. The listener began to anticipate the next turn. The crowd could sense the movement before the sentence ended. That is how preaching works at its best. It is not a straight line from speaker to audience. It is call, response, timing, and shared momentum. But somewhere in the middle of the address, the air changed. That is the moment people have told and retold for decades. Mahalia Jackson, seated behind King, had heard him speak about the dream before. She knew that language. She knew its power. At some point, as King moved through the prepared text, she called out to him, urging him to tell the crowd about the dream. The exact way that moment sounded has become part of the memory of the day, but the substance is clear enough. A voice from behind him called him toward a theme he knew well, a theme he had used before, a theme that was not at the centre of the prepared text in that same way. King responded. He moved away from the manuscript. You can almost feel the shift even now if you watch the recording or read accounts from people who studied the speech closely. The prepared argument had been strong. Then something else opened. Not something less political. Not something vague. Something more expansive. He turned from the language of debt, urgency, and protest into the language of vision. He began to describe the country not only as it had failed to be, but as it might become if it finally took its own promises seriously. This is where the speech entered the part that millions would remember. King spoke of a dream, and the phrase repeated, but the repetition was not ornamental. Each use placed the dream in a different American landscape and a different human situation. The South appeared. Former slaves and former slaveholders appeared through their descendants. His own children appeared through a hope that they would be judged by who they were rather than by race. States known for segregation appeared as places where transformation could still happen. The dream was not a soft escape from politics. It was a way of making political and moral change imaginable in human terms. That is why the passage works so powerfully. Legislation can be necessary and still sound distant. Legal equality can be essential and still feel abstract to people listening from far away. King's dream language translated law into life. It made the Civil Rights Bill, voting rights, school integration, and equal citizenship feel connected to children, neighbours, tables, hills, states, songs, and the ordinary desire to live without humiliation. He did not abandon the demands of the march. He gave them a human destination. The crowd responded. You can hear it in recordings, but a recording cannot fully reproduce what it would have felt like to stand there. Applause rose. People called out. Some likely nodded, cried, smiled, shouted, or stood very still. A great speech does not affect everyone in the same way at the same second. Some people are moved immediately, some understand later, some remember one line, some remember the sound more than the words, some remember the person next to them reacting. But the collective response told King that the speech had found its current. He was no longer simply delivering prepared remarks. He was riding the energy between pulpit and crowd. Mahalia Jackson's presence in that moment matters for more than a famous anecdote. She represented the musical and religious culture that shaped the movement's emotional language. King's speaking style did not emerge from nowhere. It belonged to black church traditions in which music, sermon, scripture, repetition, and communal response were deeply connected. Jackson knew that world. When she urged him toward the dream, she was not editing a speech in the ordinary sense. She was calling a preacher toward the part of his own language that could lift the crowd. It was an intervention from inside the tradition that had formed him, and King knew how to answer that call. His voice changed as the dream section unfolded. It became more musical, more openly sermonic, more rhythmically charged. The pace gathered. The repeated phrase became a platform from which each image could rise. The crowd no longer had to follow a complex argument line by line. They could feel the direction. Each sentence pointed toward a country not yet present but not impossible. That balance was essential. If the dream had sounded easy, it would have been false. If it had sounded impossible, it would have been despair. King made it sound morally required. He then moved toward the language of freedom ringing. Again, this was not new material invented in the moment. He had used versions of it before, and it drew from patriotic song and religious cadence. But at the Lincoln Memorial, before that crowd, it took on a different scale. He named places across the country, mountains and states, including places associated with both national grandeur and racial violence. The geography widened. The speech no longer belonged only to Washington, or only to the South. It moved across the whole nation. The repeated call made the country itself the stage. If freedom rang only in some places, it was not enough. It had to ring everywhere. For people in the crowd, those place names would have landed differently depending on where they were from. Someone from Georgia might hear their home named and feel the force of it. Someone from Mississippi might hear a state associated with fear and resistance named as a place of possible transformation. Someone from the north might understand that they were not exempt from the work. The list of places made the dream national. It refused to let any region stand outside the argument. The conclusion gathered the speech into a shared hope of liberation. King's final movement was not only about black freedom, though black freedom was central and urgent. It imagined a future in which all of God's children, as he put it in his own religious language, could join in freedom. That ending allowed many Americans to hear the speech as inclusive, but it should not be stripped of its specific demand. The unity King imagined was not cheap unity. It was unity after justice, not unity instead of justice. The speech did not ask black Americans to forget their injuries for the comfort of others. It asked the nation to remove the conditions that made those injuries ordinary. When King stepped back from the microphone, something had shifted. Not because segregation ended that afternoon. It did not. Not because Congress immediately became easy to move. It did not. Not because everyone who heard the speech agreed. They did not. The air changed because the movement had been given a public language that could travel. The speech carried the demands of the march beyond the mall in a form people could remember. It gave newspapers headlines, television broadcasts images, supporters renewed energy, and opponents a reminder that the movement could command the nation's attention with discipline and moral force. But the memory of that moment has also created a problem. The dream became so famous that it sometimes swallowed the rest of the speech, and even the rest of the march. People remembered the hope and forgot the warning. They remembered the children and forgot the debt. They remembered the soaring ending and forgot the demand for jobs, voting rights, fair wages, desegregation, and federal enforcement. That is not King's fault. It is what public memory often does. It keeps the part that comforts later generations and quietly sets aside the part that disturbed the people who first heard it. To understand the moment honestly, we have to keep both together. The dream mattered because the injustice was real. The vision mattered because the debt had not been paid. A person standing in the crowd that day might not have thought any of this in such polished terms. They might have simply felt that the speech had lifted the day. They might have felt proud. They might have felt that the long ride had been worth it. They might have turned to the person beside them and said something simple, because most people do not speak in historical analysis while history is happening. Maybe they said, "That was something." Maybe they said nothing. Maybe they clapped until their hands hurt. Maybe they stood quietly, holding a sign, thinking of home. The power of the moment did not require everyone to explain it. The cameras caught King at the microphone, but they could not capture every person who received the speech in their own way. A child on someone's shoulders, a college student who had come from the sit-in movement, a woman who had donated money for the bus and then found a way to come herself, a veteran who had served a country that still denied him full rights, a worker who heard the word freedom and thought of wages, a parent who thought of children, a mourner who thought of Medgar Evers, a minister who heard the cadence of the black church rising on national ground. Each person took the speech into a different life. That is why the phrase, "changed the air," fits the moment. It was not that the air became lighter exactly. The problems remained heavy. But the atmosphere of the day shifted from demand alone into demand joined with vision. Before King, the programme had named the injuries and the policy goals with force. King did that too, and then he gave the crowd a way to imagine the country after the injuries had been answered. Movements need both. They need the list of demands, the legal language, the organising plan, the pressure campaign. They also need a picture of what the struggle is for, clear enough that people can keep walking when the road becomes hard again. When the applause settled and the programme moved towards its close, the march had reached its emotional high point, but the day was not over. There were still people to move safely out of the mall. There were leaders to meet with President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson at the White House. There were buses to board, trains to catch, children to gather, signs to carry home, newspapers to print, television broadcasts to replay, and politicians to decide what they would do with what they had seen. The crowd had heard the dream. Now the country would have to wake up the next morning and decide whether it meant to act. The crowd had heard the dream. Now the country would have to wake up the next morning and decide whether it meant to act. But before morning came, Washington had to return to itself. Not all at once. Not as if someone had simply turned a switch and made 250,000 people disappear. A crowd that large leaves slowly. It loosens from the edges first. People gather their bags. Parents find children. Friends search for the group they came with. Marshals give directions. Buses wait in long lines. Train stations begin to fill again. The same people who had arrived with tired faces and careful clothes now had to reverse the whole journey, carrying the day back into the ordinary world. The mall after the speeches must have had a strange feeling. Only hours earlier, the open space had been dense with bodies, signs, songs, heat, applause, and the steady pressure of people trying to hear. Now the crowd was breaking apart into smaller human units again. A church delegation, a student group, a union local, a family, a pair of friends. A minister looking for the last members of his congregation. A woman checking that she still had her purse, her programme, her gloves, her child's hand. The great public body that had stood before the Lincoln Memorial was becoming thousands of private journeys again. This is one of the quieter truths about historic days. They end in logistics. No matter how moving the speech, no matter how large the crowd, no matter how much history has shifted in the air, people still have to get home. They need water. They need restrooms. They need transportation. They need to find the bus they came on. They need to remember where the group agreed to meet. They need to decide whether to keep the sign or leave it behind. They need to get back to jobs, children, parents, farms, apartments, classrooms, churches and neighbourhoods where the problems that brought them to Washington are still waiting. The march had been orderly, and that mattered deeply. Washington had prepared for something much darker. The city had been placed under heavy security. Thousands of police officers were mobilised. Soldiers and National Guardsmen were held ready. Hospitals had prepared. Officials had worried about violence, not quietly, but openly enough that the fear became part of the day's atmosphere. Some federal workers were released early. Liquor sales were restricted. The city braced itself as if the arrival of citizens asking for rights might become a public emergency. Then the people came, stood, listened, sang, marched, and began leaving without giving the expected disaster its opportunity. That calm was not accidental. It had been built into the day. The marshals, the signs, the instructions, the speeches, the training, the decisions made in meeting rooms weeks before. All of it helped create the order people later admired. But there was something else too. The marchers themselves understood that the discipline of the day was part of the argument. They knew that the country was watching for trouble. They knew opponents of civil rights wanted images that could be used to frighten undecided Americans. They knew that one act of disorder could be used to overshadow thousands of acts of dignity. So they left as carefully as they had come. Try to picture the buses at the end of the day. Some were parked in assigned areas. Some were waiting along streets crowded with people searching for the right vehicle. The passengers were not the same as they had been that morning. Their clothes were more wrinkled now. Their feet hurt. Their voices might be hoarse from singing or cheering. Their faces might show sun, fatigue, and the drained look that comes after holding emotion in public for hours. Someone climbed the bus steps slowly because the body had finally begun to complain. Someone folded a sign and placed it on the overhead rack. Someone sat by the window and did not speak for a while. Someone else began talking immediately, trying to explain what it had felt like before the feeling became too large to hold. Inside those buses, the march began turning into memory. That process starts quickly. People say, "Did you hear when he said that? Did you see how many people were there? I could not see the stage, but I could hear. I thought I lost you near the pool. My feet are killing me. It was worth it. I never saw anything like it." The phrases would have been ordinary because people are ordinary even after extraordinary days. A person who had stood inside a historic crowd still needed to unwrap a sandwich, take off tight shoes, lean against a window, and sleep if the road allowed it. The trains leaving Washington carried the same transformation. Platforms filled again, this time with people who had already seen what they came to see. The signs that had looked fresh in the morning now looked softened by heat and handling. Programs were folded into pockets. Cameras held film that would become family evidence. People waited for departures under station lights, tired but alert when someone asked where they had come from. A train station after a political march is an interesting place because the public event has ended, but the public conversation has not. Strangers who had stood together now had something to say to one another. They had been in the same crowd. That alone gave them a temporary intimacy. Washington itself began to exhale. The city had not become the scene of mass violence some had feared. Businesses that had expected disruption found a different story. Streets that had seemed tense in anticipation were now filled with departure. Police officers who had been prepared for confrontation watched people leaving with signs, programs, and children. Federal officials who had worried about political damage now had to reckon with political power of another kind. The march had not embarrassed the movement. It had embarrassed delay. The National Mall, as evening came on, must have looked almost too large again. Public spaces can feel different after a crowd leaves them. The emptiness is not the same as before. It carries traces. A scrap of paper, a dropped program, the flattened grass, the memory of where people stood. The reflecting pool still held the sky, but it also held the reflected image of thousands of bodies and signs. The Lincoln Memorial returned to stillness, but the steps could no longer be only a tourist site in the same way. Something had been added to the place. Not stone, not metal, not a plaque yet. A memory, a claim. There is a practical side to this that should not be ignored. Someone had to clean, someone had to gather what was left behind. Someone had to restore the public space to its usual appearance. Historic days leave trash as well as inspiration. Paper cups, wrappers, discarded leaflets, signs too damaged to carry, the evidence of bodies that had stood in heat for hours. This is not a disrespectful detail. It is a human one. A clean memory often hides the labour that comes after. The city had to be made ready for the next morning, when clerks, tourists, officials and workers would return to spaces that had held one of the largest demonstrations in American history. Meanwhile, the leaders of the march did not simply go home. After the program, key organisers and civil rights leaders went to the White House to meet with President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon Johnson. That meeting mattered because it moved the day from the open air of the mall into the closed formality of presidential power. The same demands that had been shouted, sung, printed and spoken before the crowd now entered the Oval Office. The contrast is striking. Outside, hundreds of thousands of people under the sun. Inside, a smaller group of men in suits, photographs being taken, words chosen carefully, the machinery of government listening in a different register. President Kennedy had been cautious about the march before it happened. His administration feared that disorder might damage the Civil Rights Bill then before Congress. That fear tells us something about the political moment. The administration wanted progress, but it also feared the consequences of mass pressure. It wanted civil rights legislation, but it worried about anything that might make the path harder. The movement, however, understood that without pressure, the path might remain slow, narrow, and too easy for opponents to block. The march forced the administration to see not only the moral case, but the size of the constituency demanding action. The meeting after the march gave both sides something. For the leaders, it was a chance to press their demands directly after demonstrating mass support. For Kennedy, it was a chance to acknowledge the success of the day and align himself publicly with the broad cause of civil rights without losing control of the legislative process. Photographs from that meeting show familiar faces: King, Randolph, Lewis, Wilkins, Young, Reuther, and others gathered with the president and vice president. But photographs can make such meetings look smoother than they are. A photograph freezes posture. It does not show the tension between movement pressure and political calculation. It does not show what each person carried into the room from the day outside. John Lewis entered that room as a young man who had been pressured to soften his speech. Philip Randolph entered as an elder who had been imagining mass action in Washington for decades. King entered as the man whose speech had just lifted the day into lasting memory. Kennedy entered as a president trying to move civil rights legislation through a Congress where Southern opposition remained powerful. Johnson entered as vice president, a man with deep knowledge of Congress and a future role none of them could fully foresee that afternoon. They were not simply congratulating one another. They were standing at the hinge between protest and law. Outside the White House, ordinary marchers were already leaving. This is a difference worth holding. The leaders met the president, the crowd met the road. Both parts mattered. Without leaders, the movement would have lacked strategy, access, and public voices that could focus national attention. Without the crowd, the leaders would have entered the White House with far less force behind them. A president can meet a delegation and treat it as one more political conversation. It is harder to do that when the delegation has just stood before the visible proof of hundreds of thousands of people. Across the country, television began doing its own work. People who had not travelled to Washington saw images of the crowd. They heard parts of the speeches. They saw King at the memorial. They saw calm where some had predicted chaos. They saw scale. Television was not new by 1963, but its role in civil rights had become increasingly important. Birmingham had shown Americans the violence used to defend segregation. The March on Washington showed them the discipline and breadth of the movement demanding change. Those two kinds of images worked differently, but both mattered. One exposed brutality, the other displayed legitimacy. Newspapers prepared their reports, editors chose headlines, photographers selected images, columnists began framing the meaning of the day. Some would emphasize King's speech, some would emphasize the peaceful crowd, some would emphasize the political pressure on Congress, some would remain skeptical. Public memory does not form evenly. It is shaped by what newspapers print, what television repeats, what politicians say, what teachers later teach, what families remember, and what opponents try to minimize. On the evening of August 28, 1963, that process had already begun. Imagine a family watching the news that night. Maybe they had not gone to Washington. Maybe they had wanted to but could not afford it. Maybe one person from their church had gone and promised to report back. The television screen shows the crowd from above, making the people look like a living pattern along the reflecting pool. It shows King speaking. It shows faces listening. For someone watching from a living room, the march might have produced pride, relief, longing, or regret. Pride that so many had gone. Relief that the day had been peaceful. Longing to have been there. Regret that they had stayed home. And perhaps a new sense that the movement was larger than local officials had claimed. In other homes, the reaction was different. Not everyone welcomed what they saw. Segregationists did not change their minds because the crowd was orderly. Opponents of civil rights did not vanish because King spoke beautifully. Some watched with resentment. Some saw threat in the very dignity of the marchers. Some prepared to resist the legislation even harder. This also belongs in the story. The march was powerful, but it did not convert the nation in a single afternoon. History rarely moves that cleanly. What it did was make the cost of resistance more visible, and the demand for action harder to dismiss. For the marchers returning home, the emotional afterlife of the day must have varied widely. Some came back energized. They had stood in Washington. They had heard the speeches. They had seen the numbers. They had felt the strength of being together. That kind of experience can sustain people through later discouragement. It gives them a memory to draw from when local work becomes slow again. Others may have returned with a more complicated feeling. The day had been moving, but their town was still segregated. Their child's school was still unequal. Their courthouse was still hostile. Their employer was still unfair. Their landlord was still discriminatory. They had seen the promise of collective power, but they had to return to the daily structures that made the march necessary. That return is one of the hardest parts of any mass movement. A demonstration can gather people into a shared high point, but life afterward tests what the high point meant. The next morning, people had to go back to work. Students had to return to campuses. Ministers had to preach again. Organisers had to plan the next meeting. Lawyers had to continue their cases. Voter registration workers had to go back into dangerous counties. Parents had to send children back to schools that had not changed overnight. The march did not remove the burden. It gave the burden a national witness. For some, returning home carried risk. Being publicly associated with civil rights could have consequences, especially in places where local power watched closely. A photograph, a newspaper mention, a story told by the wrong person, any of these could matter. People had gone to Washington as citizens, but they returned to communities where citizenship could still be punished if practiced too boldly. This is part of why their participation was courageous. The danger was not only what might happen during the march, it was what might happen after, and yet there was also joy. We should not make the aftermath too heavy without noticing that. People had seen something many would remember for the rest of their lives. They had seen a movement step into the centre of the nation. They had heard leaders speak with authority. They had seen black and white Americans stand together in numbers that could not be ignored. They had watched fear fail to define the day. Joy in that context was not shallow. It was relief, pride, recognition, and possibility. It was the joy of seeing what had been said in private become visible in public. The city itself returned to routine, but routine after such a day is not exactly the same. Government offices opened, officials read reports, members of Congress heard from constituents and watched the news. The Civil Rights Bill remained before the political system with all its obstacles still in place. Southern segregationists in Congress still had power. Committees, amendments, delays, and procedural tactics still lay ahead. The march did not pass the bill. It did something different. It placed the bill under the pressure of a national moral event. It made inaction look more deliberate. This is why the peaceful end of the march mattered almost as much as the speeches. Had the day ended in violence, the story might have been bent against the movement by those eager to do so. Because it ended with order, the movement could point to the day as evidence of discipline, seriousness, and broad public support. The crowd had done what it came to do. It had made the demand visible. It had refused the role of chaos assigned to it by fearful officials. It had left Washington with the city still standing, and the country unable to claim it had not heard. As night settled over Washington, the monuments remained lit. Tourists and workers would see them again as familiar shapes. But something had changed in how those shapes could be understood. The Lincoln Memorial was no longer only the place where Americans remembered emancipation as a completed act. It had become a place where Americans had been reminded that emancipation had not completed freedom. The mall was no longer only ceremonial space. It had become proof that citizens could gather in overwhelming numbers and speak back to the nation's symbols. The White House was no longer only watching the movement from a distance. It had received its leaders immediately after the largest civil rights demonstration the Capitol had seen. Somewhere on a road out of Washington, a bus moved through the dark. Inside, people slept in awkward positions. A sign rested between seats. Someone's shoes were off. Someone stared out the window, replaying King's voice or Randolph's seriousness or Lewis's urgency. Someone thought about the meeting they would attend back home. Someone wondered whether Congress would act. Someone knew that the day had been important but did not yet know how it would be described years later. They only knew they had been there, and in the Capitol behind them, the streets grew quieter. The officials finished their notes. The reporters filed their stories. The police stood down from the emergency that had not come. The mall held the traces of feet and paper and heat. The great crowd was gone, but the demand it carried had not left with it. It had moved into newspapers, broadcasts, conversations, churches, union halls, congressional offices, and the memory of everyone who had stood in that August sun. The next question was whether that memory could become law, and whether a country that had been forced to look at itself for one long day could be forced, finally, to change what it saw. The next question was whether that memory could become law, and whether a country that had been forced to look at itself for one long day could be forced, finally, to change what it saw. That is where the story becomes slower, heavier, and in some ways more difficult than the day on the mall. A march can gather itself in the open air. A speech can move through a crowd in minutes. A photograph can travel across the country by morning. But a law has to move through rooms where the public cannot always see clearly. It has to pass through committees, amendments, party calculations, parliamentary manoeuvres, regional loyalties, personal ambitions, old hatreds, and the stubborn habits of men who know exactly how to make time work for them. The March on Washington had shown the country a disciplined demand. It had shown size, order, dignity, and urgency. It had helped make civil rights impossible to ignore. But the bill that became the Civil Rights Act of 1964 still had to survive Congress. And Congress was not a place where moral force automatically became action. It was a place where power could delay. It was a place where a small number of determined opponents could slow a nation. It was a place where the language of procedure could be used to protect the habits of segregation. After the crowd went home, the the struggle did not become less important. It became less visible. That is something worth sitting with for a moment. The most famous part of the civil rights movement often appears in images of public courage: students at lunch counters, children in Birmingham, marchers crossing bridges, crowds gathered before monuments. But legislation is also a battlefield. It is just a quieter one. There are no fire hoses in a committee room. There are no dogs lunging in a Senate debate. But the results can decide whether a child can attend a school, whether a worker can challenge discrimination, whether a traveller can enter a hotel, whether a customer can sit at a lunch counter, whether the federal government has the authority to enforce what local custom refuses to grant. The stakes are just as real, even when the room is carpeted. The Civil Rights Bill had been proposed by President John F. Kennedy earlier in 1963, after Birmingham forced the nation to look at segregation with a new intensity. Kennedy had not begun his presidency as the movement's most aggressive ally. He had often moved cautiously, balancing Southern Democrats, Cold War concerns, legal strategy, and political risk. But the events of 1963 had narrowed the space for caution. Birmingham had made delay look cruel. Medgar Evers' murder had made the danger unmistakable. The March on Washington had made the demand national and visible. By late summer, civil rights was not an issue the administration could manage with sympathy alone. It required law. Still, the bill faced a long road. Many Southern members of Congress opposed it fiercely. They saw federal civil rights legislation as a threat to the segregationist order they had defended for decades. Some spoke in the language of states' rights. Some spoke in the language of tradition. Some warned about federal overreach. But beneath those phrases was a familiar reality: the desire to preserve a racial system that had kept black citizens from full access to public life, jobs, schools, voting, and basic dignity. The language could be polished. The purpose was not. The march had made that resistance harder to disguise. When 250,000 people stand peacefully in the Capitol and ask for jobs and freedom, it becomes more difficult for opponents to say the issue is small, local, or exaggerated. When television broadcasts show a crowd of citizens listening calmly under the shadow of Lincoln, it becomes harder to claim that the movement is only disorder. The march did not remove opposition, but it changed the moral weather around the debate. It gave supporters of the bill something to point to. It gave wavering politicians evidence that the demand was large and organised. It gave ordinary citizens a picture of the people for whom the law was being fought. For King and other leaders, the march was never meant to be the last act. It was pressure. It was public testimony. It was a way to put bodies behind policy. That is easy to miss if we remember only the dream. The dream did not float away from legislation. It leaned toward it. The speeches that day demanded a strong civil rights bill, fair employment, voting rights, desegregated schools, decent housing, and economic opportunity. The moral vision and the legislative agenda belong together. Without law, the dream could become a comforting phrase. Without the dream, the law could seem like a technical adjustment rather than a national reckoning. Then, less than 3 months after the march, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. The shock of that day changed the political setting almost instantly. A president who had proposed the Civil Rights Bill was gone. Lyndon B. Johnson, a Southerner from Texas, became president. Many people did not know what that would mean for civil rights. Johnson had a long and complicated political history. He knew the Senate intimately. He knew Southern power because he had lived inside it. He knew how legislators delayed, bargained, threatened, traded, and surrendered only when pressure became greater than resistance. He also understood something Kennedy had not mastered in the same way: how Congress actually moved. In the days after Kennedy's death, Johnson made civil rights part of the slain president's legacy. He urged Congress to pass the bill, not only as policy, but as a national response to the tragedy. That was politically powerful. It did not make the bill easy. Nothing about the Civil Rights Act was easy. But Johnson used the moment with a force that surprised some of those who doubted him. He knew that mourning can fade, that sympathy can become speeches and then disappear into normal politics. He pushed before the emotional opening closed. He understood timing. In politics, timing can be as important as intention. This is one of the more complicated turns in the story. The bill that Kennedy proposed became the law Johnson signed. The movement had pressured Kennedy to act, and then Johnson used Kennedy's memory to help push the legislation forward. No single person owned the victory. It came from local activists, national organisations, lawyers, students, ministers, labour leaders, ordinary marchers, television images, presidential decisions, congressional strategy, and the pressure of people who refuse to stop. That is how major laws often happen. They are remembered under one president's signature, but they are made by many hands before the pen ever touches the page. The House of Representatives passed the bill in February 1964. That was a major step, but the Senate remained the greater obstacle. The Senate was where civil rights bills had often gone to die. Southern senators knew how to use the filibuster, a tool of extended debate to block or delay legislation they opposed. They had used it before. They were prepared to use it again. The fight over the Civil Rights Act became one of the longest and most grueling legislative battles in Senate history. For weeks, the bill occupied the chamber. Speeches went on and on. Opponents tried to wear down the supporters, to exhaust the schedule, to make compromise easier than persistence. Think about the contrast with the March on Washington. On August 28th, people had stood together for one long day in the heat. In the Senate, the bill had to endure 60 working days of debate. The crowd's discipline had been physical and public. The bill's supporters needed a different kind of discipline now, counting votes, holding coalitions, negotiating language, resisting delay, and keeping public attention alive while the drama moved indoors. The road from the mall to the law was not a straight line. It was a grind. Senator Hubert Humphrey, a Democrat from Minnesota, became one of the key floor managers for the bill. Senator Thomas Kuchel, a Republican from California, played an important role on the Republican side. Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen of Illinois became crucial because enough Republican support would be needed to end the filibuster. The bill could not pass on moral appeal alone. It needed votes, and votes had to be gathered one by one. Every senator mattered. Every amendment mattered. Every public statement mattered. Behind the scenes, people counted and counted again, because ending a filibuster required a supermajority. Supporters had to know not only who favoured civil rights in theory, but who would vote to stop debate when the pressure came. Outside Congress, the movement continued pressing. Civil rights organisations did not simply celebrate the march and step back. They lobbied, they wrote, they organised. They reminded lawmakers that the country was watching. The memory of the March on Washington helped sustain that pressure, because it had shown that the demand was not isolated. When legislators considered the bill, they did so in the shadow of that crowd. They may not have felt moved in their hearts, but they could count. They understood numbers. They understood news coverage. They understood that civil rights had become a national issue with a national constituency. This is one of the ways a single day can echo. It does not echo by repeating itself exactly. It echoes by changing what later events mean. After the march, a senator speaking against civil rights was not speaking into the same political air as before. A committee delay was not only a committee delay. A procedural manoeuvre was not only procedure. It stood against the memory of hundreds of thousands of citizens who had come to Washington peacefully and asked for action. The march had made inaction visible. That was one of its greatest achievements. The Senate filibuster finally came to a decisive moment in June 1964. After long weeks of debate, supporters moved for cloture, the procedure to end debate and allow the bill to move toward final passage. On June 10th, the Senate voted for cloture. That vote was historic. It was the first time the Senate had successfully ended a filibuster against a major civil rights bill. The number mattered, 71 to 29. A coalition of Democrats and Republicans joined to stop the delaying tactics. The vote did not mean every problem was solved. It meant the bill had survived the barrier that had killed so many earlier civil rights efforts. Imagine the emotional weight of that moment for people who had stood in Washington the previous August. Many were not inside the Senate chamber. They did not watch the roll call from the floor. They may have heard the news later by radio, newspaper, television, or word of mouth. But for those who understood the history of civil rights legislation, cloture meant something enormous. It meant the old weapon of endless delay had failed this time. It meant the Senate would have to move toward a vote. It meant the wall had cracked. 9 days later, on June 19th, the Senate passed the bill. Then the House accepted the Senate version. On July 2nd, 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. The ceremony was crowded and symbolic. Martin Luther King Jr. was there. Leaders who had marched, organised, lobbied and suffered were there. Johnson used more than one pen, handing them afterward to people connected to the struggle. That too was symbolic. A law signed with several pens after a movement built by several hands. The gesture could not capture the full history, but it pointed toward a truth. The law did not belong to Johnson alone. It did not belong to Congress alone. It belonged to a long struggle that had forced the federal government to act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was sweeping. It outlawed discrimination in public accommodations such as hotels, restaurants, and theatres. It strengthened the federal government's ability to desegregate schools and other public facilities. It prohibited employment discrimination based on race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin. It created new tools for enforcement and made clear that local custom could no longer stand above federal law in these areas. For millions of Americans, this mattered in practical ways. A lunch counter was not just a lunch counter. A hotel room was not just a hotel room. A job application was not just a form. These were places where citizenship either became real or remained theory. But it is important not to make the law do more in our memory than it did in life. The Civil Rights Act was monumental, but it did not end racism. It did not end poverty. It did not secure voting rights everywhere. It did not remove housing discrimination by itself. It did not protect every black citizen from violence. It did not guarantee that employers, schools, landlords, police departments, or local officials would suddenly act justly because the president had signed his name. Laws change the terrain of struggle. They do not end the struggle. The movement knew this. That is why the Voting Rights Act would come the next year after Selma. That is why fights over housing, jobs, schools, policing, and economic justice continued. The law was a victory, not a finish line. Still, we should not let that realism flatten the achievement. For people who had lived under legal segregation, the Civil Rights Act mattered profoundly. It gave the federal government authority to intervene in places where local power had been used to deny rights. It gave individuals and organizations legal tools. It declared that certain forms of discrimination were not merely unfortunate, not merely rude, not merely local tradition, but unlawful. That matters. That. A law cannot change every heart, but it can change what institutions are allowed to do. It can give people grounds to challenge abuse. It can move the line between what a society tolerates and what it condemns. The March on Washington echoed into that law in several ways. It showed the scale of public support. It gave the Civil Rights Bill moral urgency. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined and nationally persuasive. It helped connect civil rights to jobs and economic justice, even though the final law did not fulfill all the march's economic demands. It kept the issue in front of the country at a moment when political leaders might otherwise have preferred a slower path. It gave the movement an image that could not be easily dismissed. A vast, orderly crowd before Lincoln, asking the nation to honour its own promises. But the echo was not only political, it was personal. The people who had gone to Washington carried the day home and told others. They spoke about the size of the crowd. They described King's speech. They described the heat, the songs, the buses, the feeling of standing among so many. Those stories mattered because movement survived through memory as well as strategy. A person who heard the story from a parent, a minister, a neighbour or a teacher might feel that they too had inherited part of the obligation. Public law and private memory moved together. There must have been people who kept their signs, people who folded programmes into drawers, people who saved newspapers from the next morning, people who told children, "I was there," or "your grandmother was there," or "our church sent a bus." These small acts of remembering helped turn the march into more than a date. They made it family history, church history, union history, neighbourhood history. National memory is built from those smaller memories, and sometimes the smaller ones are more durable because they have a voice attached to them. For the leaders, the work continued. King did not stop with the Civil Rights Act. Randolph did not stop caring about economic justice. Student activists did not stop pushing for voting rights and deeper change. Women who had been limited on the march platform did not stop leading. Local organisers did not stop facing danger. The movement kept moving because the conditions that produced the march had not disappeared. The Act of 1964 answered some demands and left others exposed. That is often the pattern of reform. One victory reveals the next unfinished thing. This is where the title of the march keeps returning with force: jobs and freedom. The Civil Rights Act addressed public accommodations and employment discrimination, among other things. But the economic demands of the march reached further. The organisers had called for decent jobs, fair wages, and a federal commitment to employment. Those demands were not fully met by the law. The march's economic vision remained partly unfinished, and in later years King would turn more directly toward poverty, labour, and economic inequality. If we remember only the dream of racial harmony, we miss that larger demand. The marchers had not come only to be treated politely in public. They had come to demand the material conditions of full citizenship. That is why the echo of August 28th did not stop on July 2nd. It continued into the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It continued into debates over fair housing. It continued into labour struggles, school desegregation fights, affirmative action debates, and arguments about what equality requires beyond removing the most visible signs of segregation. A day can echo for a very long time when it names a problem larger than the law that first answers it. And yet, if we return to the ordinary people at the centre of this story, the meaning becomes simpler and sharper. A woman who had once been turned away from a hotel could now point to federal law. A worker denied a job because of race had a new claim. A child entering a public facility entered a legal world changed by people who had marched before they were born. A family travelling across state lines moved through a country that had been forced, at least in law, to open doors it had kept closed. The change was not perfect. It was not always immediate. It was often resisted. But it was real. So when we say that 250,000 Americans changed history in one day, we're not saying that one day did all the work. That would be too simple, and the people who did the work deserve better than simplicity. They changed history because that day gathered years of courage into a form the nation could see. They changed history because the crowd strengthened the hand of those fighting for legislation. They changed history because their discipline denied opponents the story they wanted to tell. They changed history because they made delay look like a choice, not an accident. They changed history because they stood in a place built for national memory and forced that memory to face the present. The law came later, after grief, after bargaining, after filibuster, after vote counts, after speeches in the Senate that stretched through long days, after pressure from the movement and calculation from politicians. But when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, the shadow of the march was in the room. Not physically, perhaps, The crowd was gone. The buses had long since returned home. The mall had been cleaned. The signs had been stored, discarded, or saved. The heat of that August day had passed into another season. But the presence of those people remained in the political atmosphere. Their one day had become part of the reason the law could not be delayed forever. And this is where the story settles, not into a neat ending, but into a clearer understanding of how history often works. It is rarely one speech, one president, one vote, one law, or one crowd by itself. It is pressure moving from one form to another. A private injury becomes a local meeting. A local meeting becomes a campaign becomes a photograph becomes national outrage becomes a march becomes pressure becomes votes become law becomes a tool becomes another struggle, and through all of it are people whose names are rarely remembered, waking early, packing food, boarding buses, standing in heat, singing when they are tired, going home, and continuing. The March on Washington did not end the civil rights movement. It did not complete the promise of America. It did not make the country suddenly honest. But it changed what could be denied. It made the demand visible in a way that even power had to answer. It gave the Civil Rights Act a public force that no private negotiation could have created. It placed ordinary citizens in the centre of a national decision and reminded the government that the governed were watching. Somewhere, years later, a person who had been in that crowd might hear the words Civil Rights Act and think, not first of the Senate roll call or the signing ceremony, but of the road to Washington, the heat, the songs, the long wait, the view of the Lincoln Memorial, the sound of King's voice moving over the crowd, the ache in the feet, the bus ride home, the feeling of having stood with so many others and asked the country to become what it said it already was. That feeling was not written into the law, but it helped carry the law into being. And long after the pens were put away, long after the official photographs were filed, long after the buses disappeared back into the cities and towns that had sent them, that day remained. It remained in the law. It remained in the movement. It remained in the people who remembered. It remained in every argument that said freedom had to be more than a word, more than a monument, more than a promise postponed for another generation. It remained as proof that ordinary people, gathered at the right moment with discipline and purpose, could stand in the open air for one day and make the machinery of history move.